Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Guadalupe Fernandez. I am the director of the Children's Immigration Network with Children at Risk, and I'm so excited to have you join us at our annual Immigration Summit. For those that are new, Children at Risk is a research and advocacy nonprofit leading the way in improving the quality of life for Texas children. Children at Risk considers the whole child by tracking issues in children's health, safety, education, and economic security. Committed to action beyond the data, Children at Risk drives evidence-based change by speaking out on behalf of children. You can view the agenda for today's program and get to know our featured experts using the links dropped in the chat. If you have any questions, please submit those to our speakers using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. After the event, all registrants will receive the slide deck and any resources shared, as well as the link to watch the recording of today's event. Before we jump in, I'd like to take a moment to thank the folks who made this event possible. First and foremost, let's give a shout out to our generous, engaged sponsors, the Center for Law and Social Policy, CLASP, Amazon, and Jarritos, Novamex, and the Merrick Family Foundation. Last but never least, we can never forget to recognize our community partners. Thank you, the Children's Network, the Children Action Thrive Network, CTAN, and Texas Family Leadership Council for your continued partnership in our immigration work over the years. Speaking of CLASP, I'm excited to welcome Wendy Cervantes, Director of Immigration and Immigrant Families with the Center for Law and Social Policy, CLASP, to provide opening remarks. Wendy, would you join me on camera?
Yes, I will. Thank you. And good morning. And thank you, Guadalupe, for that introduction. Again, my name is Wendy Cervantes. I'm the director of the Immigration and Immigrant Families team at the Center for Law and Social Policy, or CLASP. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're an anti-poverty organization based in Washington, D.C., dedicated to advancing federal and state policy solutions that support children, youth, and families with low incomes and communities of color in the U.S. I'm so excited to be with you all today and to welcome you to the third annual National Immigration Summit centering the needs of children and families. It's an honor to partner once again with Children at Risk and the Children's Partnership on this important event to discuss the opportunities and challenges facing children and immigrant families and how we can all work together to advance a brighter future for this important child population. I'm here with you today as a policy expert, but also as the daughter of Mexican immigrants, the wife of a Guatemalan immigrant, and the mother of two young daughters. So the topics we're going to cover today are deeply personal to me, as they are to so many of you. And it's particularly important for us to come together at this time because for those of you who work with immigrant families every day or are part of an immigrant family, you know that there's so very much at stake right now. We're here today after 2 years of a crushing pandemic that has had a disproportionate impact on mixed status immigrant families, including long-term effects on their children's development. We're also here after a year and a half of a new Congress and administration where we've seen mixed results. This includes falling short of passing historic legislation late last year that would have established major investments in programs that support children and families and would have secured a pathway to citizenship for millions of immigrants. In addition to that, there have been significant shortcomings and delays in the efforts to roll back many of the harmful immigration policies of the previous administration, and programs like the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program, continue to be at risk. But even with the heartbreaking disappointments, there has also been tremendous progress and hard-fought wins at the federal and state level that have paved the way for us to not just roll back some of the harm, but to start addressing the deep-rooted and systemic barriers that have left children of immigrants and other children of color behind, and finally begin to realize policies that truly promote the well-being of all our children. But to get there in these times of uncertainty and setbacks, it's important for us to learn from where we've been and get ready for the work ahead. We're lucky today to be joined by several incredible experts to help us do just that, and we're eager to hear from all of you as well. Topics today will include federal immigration policy, state policy efforts, mental health, education access, and strategies for changing the public narrative with a focus on kids and families. Next slide. Today, all of our sessions will make it clear that immigration policy is a children's issue and that the status quo is simply not working for our kids. We know what children need, and that includes loving, stable caregivers, a safe place to live, plenty of nutritious food to eat, high quality childcare, and education opportunities from pre-K through higher education, and economically stable families. Yet too often our immigration policies undermine the ability of children to achieve their full potential, threatening each of these fundamental pillars of child well-being. It is our hope that you will leave today with some new ideas on how to integrate immigration issues into your own work, and most importantly, that you will feel some renewed energy to keep pushing for change. Next slide. Related to that, I wanted to share some information about the Children Thrive Action Network, or CTAN, a national network dedicated to supporting and defending children of immigrants in the U.S. CLASP and several of the organizations involved with today's summit are part of the leadership of the network, and hopefully some of you are already members. The goal of the network is to center children and mixed status immigrant families and advocacy on immigration and other intersecting policies. We're currently comprised of over 130 active members and allies representing a wide range of local, state, and national organizations who work directly with or on behalf of children and immigrant families. Membership spans more than 30 states, and we have expertise in a variety of areas, including immigration, education, healthcare, nutrition, housing, early childhood, and more. I've included CTAN's website here for more information and encourage you all to sign up as a member. Membership is free, and I also invite you to follow us on Twitter at Let Kids Thrive. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Guadalupe, and thank you.
Thanks, Wendy. And to really kick off the content for today's event, we'd first like to set the stage and answer, who are we talking about today before we get going? Let's begin to look at the data landscape and the state of immigrant children and families in the US. We're going to move through these pretty quickly, but don't worry, you will receive a copy of the slides shared today, so don't fret about taking detailed notes. Delivering this data presentation overview is our valued partner, President with the Children's Partnership, Mayra Alvarez, who was also super helpful in helping us plan this event and even get some of this data. And joining her to make up this morning's dynamic duo is our very own President and CEO, Dr. Bob Sanborn. Mayra and Dr. Bob, will you join me on camera again?
Very good. Mayra, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well, Bob. How are you? Thanks
Very
so
good.
much for this opportunity to partner.
Yeah, this is the third time that we've done this together, Mayra, and I'm excited about it. But this is the first time that Jarritos has been a sponsor, which makes it even better. It's just sweeter, isn't it, Mayra, just to have Jarritos?
I think so. Absolutely. It puts that final touch on it.
Very good. And Mayra, in the last year, you've also become a mom. So this is like a big deal, right? Is this the first time that you've done the immigration stuff, being a mom, right?
It is. To Wendy's point, these issues are absolutely deeply personal. As the daughter of Mexican immigrants and a new mom to my own daughter, it's a completely different perspective on the work that we are all doing together to improve the health and well-being of every child in our country.
Yeah, very good. Well, let's go to the slide. And Mayra and I will go through this quickly so that you guys can get some idea of the data. And if I can, Mayra, I just want to start the number of kids, right? We're talking about 17.8 million children that often I call sometimes New American Children. That comes from a Time magazine cover, but they're children of immigrants in the United States, representing 1 in 4 children in our country. Moreover, and I know we'll talk a little bit about this, is that when you look at our states, Mayra, you in California, me in Texas, 1/4 of all the children born in America are born in our 2 states. And yet a large portion of those kids are immigrants. And when you look across the states where you see vibrant economic stuff going on, it's where there's a lot of immigrants. We talk about the growth in Texas and California, but we also have that growth in immigrants. And I think it can't go unnoticed.
Absolutely not. And I think to the point of the growth that is happening, you also see that it is our immigrant families that are really driving the ethnic diversity of our country and the growth of children population in general. If you look at the roughly 18 million children of immigrants in our country, about a third are young children. So these are immigrant parents who are having our babies and they're going to grow up to be our future workforce, actually really driving, this economic engine of our communities and also contributing so much beauty and diversity to our everyday lives as well.
I think the other thing that bears notice is that I have a sociologist friend of mine at Rice University who talks about if we closed our borders today, which we're not going to do, but if we close them today, we still have this overwhelming majority of young kids that are immigrant kids, right? And it's part of the face of our country. It's part of who we are as a country. We have to acknowledge that.
Absolutely.
Very good. Let's go to the next slide. Myra?
Yeah. So like you said, Bob, fully 1 in 4 children in our country are children of immigrants. So really thinking about how every issue is a children's issue, you really have to think about how every issue is a children of immigrants issue. And as we collectively want to fight for the well-being of children, considering the impacts of immigration, the impacts of immigration policy on the well-being of children today has to be intricately tied to our fight for kids' overall well-being. You can't think about an immigration policy issue and not consider the impacts on child well-being. And especially when we're considering that many children in immigrant families are actually living below the federal poverty line. Disproportionately, they are facing harder day-to-day lives as a result of the job sector that their parents are a part of, the community conditions in which they are raised. So really, when we're fighting for anti-poverty legislation and policy, considering the impacts on immigrant families and their children is particularly important. To your point, they are such an important part of our economic engine, and ensuring their economic security is ensuring the overall economic security of our country.
And if we always talk about, and we see this legislatures across the United States talk about this idea of making sure that our children are successful. And yet one of the things that we understand when we have over 3 million kids that live below the federal poverty level, you could probably double that to say those that are being raised in low income families in general. Mm-hmm. Those families, as we know, immigrant families rarely take advantage of benefits that might be available to them to make sure that their kids can really get ahead. And we don't make it easy for those families to take advantage of this. So I think that's something that's part of the dialogue, part of the discussion as well, is that what are we doing in terms of making sure those kids are successful? Moreover, when we look at our schools and we look at the number of kids that are in schools, very rarely do you find school districts that are doing something proactive to help this significant portion of our child population, the children of immigrants. And I think that also bears looking at.
Absolutely. And this is the map of our country, and you can see from the colors of the map where there is a larger proportion of children and immigrants in these states. To your earlier point, Bob, if you look at Texas and California, the shade of red is quite dark, particularly in California. We are a proud state to host roughly half of our 9 million children are part of an immigrant family. They have at least one immigrant parent. If you look across the country, it's Texas, it's California, it's New Jersey, New York, Florida, Illinois, that really are hosting, many of our children and immigrant families, but they're all across the country. Immigrant communities are contributing to the everyday livelihood of every state's economy and well-being. And again, considering the policies that we're advancing to support the overall well-being of Americans, we also have to consider how they will impact children and immigrant families. This month, we had the fortune of working with Children Thrive Action Network and PIF California, the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign, to launch a specific fact sheet on children and immigrant families, and really highlighted just how disadvantaged immigrant families have been during this pandemic, during our attempts at economic recovery because of immigration restrictions. And really trying to level the playing field for children and immigrant families is something we must prioritize as we consider their future contributions, but their overall well-being today. So something to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will point out, economic vitality in the United States is in those states with the deepest colors, right? That's where we're finding economic vitality. Let's go to the next slide. I like this chart because it gives us an idea. So often in the United States, we think about immigrants and children of immigrants as Latinos and specifically Mexican Americans. And yes, they make up a large percentage, but I felt like, during the last year, we had this event in Del Rio, Texas, where Haitians were coming across. And it almost seemed like this was a light bulb for many in our community, many in the United States, to think, oh, so it's not just Latinos that are immigrants. And I think it's important for people to understand the richness of our immigrant pool, Asians, African Americans, for people from the Middle East. I mean, it's very rich. And yes, the majority may be from Mexico, but we're still talking about a very rich diversity here.
Absolutely. Recognizing the diversity of the population, it really also opens the tent of support that is necessary for children and immigrant families. They're the large, growing population of children and young people, but they've been that key driver of our child population growth and the contribution of our ethnic diversity as a country as a whole. The overwhelming majority of children of immigrants are children of color. So again, in considering, the racial injustices that our children are watching, this shift in considering the impacts of racism and historical racism, really, and present day racism, those have implications on the well-being of children today, and in particular, children in immigrant families. And also, we must consider that children in immigrant families are facing multiple challenges related to immigration, including the chilling effect of public charge and other policies that people will discuss today, but also, like we talked about, those restrictions to critical programs, again, that will be talked about. So really considering what we must do to support their well-being is why we are here today.
You and I worried that we would fill 7 minutes. We had no problem, Maida.
None at all.
It was fine. So Maida, thank you very much. On behalf of all of us, we love this partnership, and I'm excited about this day. Guadalupe, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Bob and Maida. That was amazing foundational data. And with that, I'm excited to introduce our first panel discussion of the day. While a pathway to citizenship and other fixes to the immigration system were included as part of a major budget legislative package last year, the bill did not achieve final passage. Our first panel discussion will explore the federal immigration opportunities and challenges that the current landscape holds for kids and families. Moderating this discussion on federal policy is Juan Carlos Gomez, policy analyst for the Immigration and Immigrant Families with CLASP. Juan will be joined in this discussion by Bilal Ashkar, communications coordinator, Welcome with Dignity campaign. Carolina Canizales, senior Texas campaign strategist with the Immigration Legal Resource Center, and Miriam Abaya, vice president, Immigration and Children's Rights with First Focus Campaign for Children. As a reminder, you can learn more about our guest speakers today by using the link dropped in the chat. And with that, Juan, take it away.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us for the first panel of today's summit. We're excited to begin this discussion on federal immigration opportunities and challenges that the current landscape holds for kids and families, as well as how state and local advocates can help support those federal advocacy efforts. As you know, the healthy development of children in immigrant families is directly linked to our nation's future prosperity. Yet, as was highlighted earlier, children in immigrant families, including those that are immigrants themselves or US citizens living in mixed status families, are more likely to be low income and face unique barriers to accessing critical healthcare, nutrition, and other safety net programs, which are proven to help children in low income families thrive. These barriers can include things such as language and cultural challenges, systemic barriers for enrollment, and other immigration-related concerns. The patchwork of different eligibility for programs depending on immigration status and which state or sometimes even the city you live in adds another layer to that unnecessary confusion. Children with undocumented parents also face the constant fear of losing a parent to deportation. In the interior, our immigration laws often fail to consider the best interest of children. And the real or perceived threat of separation from a parent due to immigration enforcement creates instability and constant stress for children in mixed status families, which has serious consequences for their long-term development. On the border, unaccompanied children and children arriving to the US with their families have the right to seek asylum, but continue to be turned away or face harmful conditions. Much of these harmful policies are at the federal level and require Congress or the administration to take action. While the Biden administration and Congress have taken some steps to improve the lives of immigrant families, much work still needs to be done. Last year, we came close to seeing a pathway to citizenship and other critical programs which would benefit immigrant families included in the Build Back Better Act. Unfortunately, the Build Back Better Act did not pass into law, but advocacy from the community showed the power of immigrant families and the necessity to center them in laws considered by Congress. A pathway to citizenship would have a positive impact on child well-being, including more stable employment opportunities for their parents, improved access to healthcare, nutrition assistance, and income supports, and protection from immigration enforcement. An estimated 1 million children are currently undocumented themselves, and millions of young people who entered the country as children, also known as dreamers, have grown up in the US and face an uncertain future in the country they call home. A pathway to citizenship remains one of the most important ways to address so many of the barriers children and immigrant families face. Under the Biden administration, thankfully, the Trump-era public charge rule, which sought to turn away immigrants from accessing public benefits, has been overturned, and we're currently waiting for a new final rule from the Biden administration later this year. The Biden administration has also taken steps to strengthen the protected areas policy, which would prevent immigration enforcement actions from taking place in locations such as healthcare facilities, schools, and other places where children gather. However, immigration enforcement has largely been left unchanged from the previous administration. This includes on the border, where Title 42 and the Migrant Protection Protocols, two policies established by the Trump administration to block asylum seekers, continue to be implemented. We're now going to turn to our panel to hear from experts about what can still be done during this unpredictable climate, and as the congressional session comes to a close and opportunities for legislative action wind down. We're going to start with a question for Bilal. Bilal, the Biden administration indicated early on that they intended to end many of the Trump-era policies that were hurting asylum seekers by blocking them from seeking asylum at our southern border. What policies remain in place today, and what are the implications for children and families of those policies?
Thank you, Juan, and thank you to everyone for organizing this panel. It's an honor to be here. Like many of our speakers, these issues are deeply personal. I was only 5 years old when I came here with my parents from Afghanistan as an asylum seeker, and I, those memories are still fresh with me, just because they were so stark. And of course, those issues have come up over. All over again, with the fall of Afghanistan last summer, and seeing the evacuation and being involved in helping some people come here, and seeing how the children and teenagers who came here without adult parents were treated was eye-opening. So thank you for this panel. To your question, today was a Supreme Court decision day, and many people on this call joined me with bated breath to see if the decision on Remain in Mexico, or MPP, the Migrant Protection Protocols, was going to be among one of them. So as we know, Trump administration, led by Stephen Miller, who was the architect of the Muslim ban, and a lot of the other xenophobic and racist white supremacist policies, dreamt up of MPP as a way to basically just shut down our asylum system. And while the Biden administration did eventually take the right step in calling for its wind down, it was challenged in court in Biden versus Texas. And that means that, it's still in effect today. When I went to Tijuana earlier this year to talk to some families who had been impacted by MPP and Title 42, the reality of the situation was even more stark than I thought. There was a young mother who had 3 children. One of them was a newborn, who was fleeing just unspeakable violence from Guatemala, and came to our doorstep to ask for safety, as is her human right and her, her right in international law and U.S. law. she came to the border and asked us for safety, and they said, sorry, there's no asylum. You have to go back to Mexico and stay there. And because the shelters, because of policies like MPP and Title 42, the shelters in Tijuana are just overwhelmed beyond capacity. She had to find safety in just a friendly, Mexican woman's house that, and so she was staying in her garage, and the garage, because the conditions there were so terrible, a rabid dog came in and mauled her baby. And she lost her baby. She lost her baby, and then she went to the border again to say, look, it is not safe for my family to be here. They said, sorry, there's no asylum, go back. So remain in Mexico and Title 42 have just horrific implications for the people who believe that we are their last best hope for safety and a chance at life. But either because of court decisions or because of frankly the Biden administration's unwillingness to take take a courageous stand on ending these policies, and they're still in effect. And what that means is that in reality, we don't have a functioning asylum system today like we did when my family presented themselves. And so those are the two greatest barriers right now. And then, of course, we can talk about systemic racism, the fact that, the way that Ukrainians who come to the Mexican border and ask for protection are granted exemptions right away, but Haitians and other people of color are not, right? And so that's not a policy, but that's a very real barrier to safety for people as well. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bilal, and thank you for all the work that you do to fight against those really inhumane policies as well. We're going to turn to Carolina now to talk a little bit about immigration enforcement in the interior as well. Millions of children remain at risk of being separated from a parent due to a parent's detention or deportation. The Biden administration committed to rolling back harsh interior enforcement policies that are resulting in more deportations, including deportations of parents of U.S. citizen children. What good policy changes have we seen over the past year and a half, and where has the administration fallen short?
Thank you, everyone. I hope you can hear me well with my headset. Hi, everyone. I'm Carolina. I'm with the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, and I am based in San Antonio, Texas. And I'm very happy to join all of you here. Thank you, Children at Risk and partners, for making this happen. Although very little, there were some things that we did see a little bit of improvement when it comes to the enforcement, but we still see so much more, right, that needs to be done. Briefly, I want to go over how this administration, because of the pressure of the movement, started with a moratorium on deportation. However, it was supposed to last 100 days. It only lasted a week because Texas litigated, which is the story that seems to happen every day. Anything wants to advance, right? Immigration, Texas or Florida will litigate. We have seen a reduction in adult detention. We have seen that. It's definitely not as high as during the last years of the Trump administration, but that's also due to the movement and organizing that happens to shut down multiple adult facilities, detention facilities in the country, and also, of course, trying to eliminate some of that private aspect of this detention, right? We also saw some initial change in the enforcement priorities, where not everybody, like under the Trump administration, anybody was a priority, and now it's very specific to those who have had contact with the criminal legal system, which, for the record, I still think it's a very dangerous path to conflate the criminal legal system with the immigration system and find excuses as to why people need to be deported under those grounds. And even though we saw some reduction of those enforcement activities when the new guidelines started rolling out, we also saw so much litigation. And as you know, right now, the latest iteration of the enforcement priorities rolled by DHS and Secretary Mayorkas are now in the Fifth Circuit, which is Texas versus US again. So we do not know what's going to happen to some of that flexibility that we've enjoyed so far. And then I do think one of the probably most positive things that I've seen is that DHS has been open to individual parole cases in which we've been able to return people that were deported, previously deported into the US. However, they take a tremendous amount of effort and resources and incredibly smart legal teams, which we all know not everybody has that, right? So then not everybody can get a chance at being able to be paroled back in. But that is one positive thing I've been able to witness. Where has the administration fallen short? Well, there's a longer list here. And it is a list that can still be done through administrative action, right? So we still need to push and keep pushing for them to do it. I think one of the first thing is agreements between police department, local law enforcement agencies, and federal immigration agencies. We have things like 287G. We have things like BOSAs in Florida. We have all kinds of agreements, intergovernmental service agreements that allow this never-ending relationship between law enforcement and ICE, right, or Border Patrol. Those contracts, we have all the data that proves that they reduce safety in our communities. We have all the data that proves that it increases racial profiling. And we have all the data that proves that they're costly to the localities that choose, to be part of these contracts. However, they still exist and they're going up instead of going down. If Biden wanted any day with an administrative action, he could end all of these contracts any day, anytime, anywhere. We also have DHS reviewing a lot of human rights violation in existing immigration adult detention facilities across the country. They could also choose to close down those facilities anytime or any day because they have data that supports how inhumane these places are. I also think it's something that we are not fully there yet or understanding the impact of this, but surveillance and tech, it's a new way of incarceration, or like what we like to call in this criminal justice world, e-carceration. And I think this is where the Biden administration has been wanting to invest more in. We saw congressional budgets being passed last year that gave so much money for this type of new enforcement, which is tech and surveillance, which we don't think is any more different, right, than physical detention because it's still not allowing people to feel free. So definitely pushing to divest, right, no longer invest in these types of technologies and surveillance to keep our people like restricted. And then I do think that there is more that this administration could do when it comes to no longer putting criminal bars for enforcement trade-offs or border militarization trade-offs every time we see a positive relief bill come through. And I think it's not just up to the administration, but it's also up to us as advocates to try and get those clean proposals so that we don't have to keep harming us every time we have a chance of relief. And then lastly, I think the Biden administration could do so much more to keep very wild states like Texas and Florida from being unchecked. We have a Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice needs to be investigating the awfulness violations of human and civil and constitutional rights that are happening in states like Texas. The only one example I want to, and Florida has a lot, but Florida has unlicensed facilities for unaccompanied minors. So there's no way to keep minors safe under OR custody, which is supposed to be a child welfare, agency for kids that are immigrating. But Texas, we are criminalizing migrants since last year, which includes youth and unaccompanied minors. They get arrested under trespassing criminal charges, and then they get deported. And this is really, really bad. And the administration has yet to call it out. And the Department of Justice has yet to open an investigation, despite the moral outcry that we've been doing here in Texas and as advocates. So I definitely think there's so much that they could do, not only with administrative action, but there's so much that they could do to try and keep a check on some states that are going far beyond what we knew they could go. We cannot normalize what's happening in Texas with Operation Lone Star, because then every time that people are trying to come in through the Texas border, there will no longer be any type of like asylum or anything, because they're instead are going to be criminalized right away. So I think this is something that the Biden administration must denounce and must intervene to stop it from growing or spreading to other states. So those are some of the ideas that I wanted to share. But again, I have hope in our movement and in our organization that we can continue to keep pushing this administration for the remaining of their time until they continue to do more on the administrative side of things, even though we can have another opportunity on the ledge. But I do think that we still have an opportunity. We must keep pushing, because we can't allow Polimigra or police ICE work anymore, and we can't allow the criminalization of migrants, which includes youth, non-accompanied minors, to spread and continue. So thank you, everyone. And I'm going to put a link if you want to learn more about Operation Lone Star on the top for those who are unfamiliar with it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Catalina, and thank you for all the work that you do. We're going to turn it over to Miriam now. Immigrants, including those that are lawfully present, have historically faced unique barriers to accessing healthcare, nutrition, and other basic needs. And policies like the Trump public charge rule resulted in a chilling effect that made immigrants even more fearful to access benefits for themselves or their children. What policy proposals have we seen by either the administration or by members of Congress to address these concerns?
Thanks, Juan, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. And it's an honor to be on this panel with Bilal and with Carolina. So I'll start with the Biden administration. So the Biden administration, as you mentioned earlier, started by officially rescinding the Trump public charge rule. And so that means that eligible children and families can access healthcare, nutrition, housing, and other benefits without fear of immigration consequences. And the next step is the administration took steps to communicate that change in public charge policy to state benefit granting agencies and immigrant serving organizations, and to families themselves, such as through a public charge resource page on a government website and bulletins from the US Department of Agriculture and Health and Human Services, to let people know using SNAP benefits and healthcare, for example, will not have immigration consequences. But the most important thing that the Biden administration did is they put out a new proposed public charge rule. And this is important because, first, a rule is stable and harder to undo than guidance, which is what the current policy is. But secondly, it also provides an opportunity to improve on past policy. The current policy was put in place in 1999, and a lot has changed since then in terms of what benefits are available to families, but also what we know about how important benefits programs are for children and families. So just as a description of the proposed rule, it's very similar to the 1999 guidance. So it would look at use of benefits like temporary assistance for needy families, or TANF, supplemental security income like SSI, and Medicaid for long-term institutional care when making a public charge determination. But it would not look at non-cash benefits like food assistance, housing assistance, and health benefits like the child health insurance program. So that's unlike the Trump rule previously. But even under the rule, even if someone does use TANF or SSI or Medicaid for long-term institutional care, that does not mean that person is automatically a public charge. The government still has to look at the totality of the circumstances of that person's life to determine if they are likely to be a public charge in the future. One of the very important changes that the rule made is it narrowed the definition of what it means to receive a public benefit. So it made really clear that if you are seeking immigration status like a green card, you can apply for or receive benefits on behalf of your child or family member without consequences to your application. And that is huge in terms of addressing the chilling effect that the Trump administration rule put in place. Are there improvements that could be made to the rule? Absolutely. And many advocates, including some I'm sure on this call, made comments to the government to suggest changes to make the rule clearer and fairer for families, and to encourage the government to do real community outreach and education about the final rule. And Juan, as you mentioned, we hope to see a new and improved final rule in the next few months. But members of Congress have actually also taken action, as you hinted at, Juan. immigrants, and including lawfully present immigrants like green card holders, those with DACA, those with temporary protected status, survivors of childhood abuse and neglect, they still face obstacles. Either they are not eligible for benefits or they have to wait 5 years before using those benefits. And I want to make clear that it wasn't always that way. These restrictions were passed in 1996. And that's when Congress passed laws generally restricting access to key benefits that disproportionately impacted communities of color, and that includes immigrants. So Representative Jayapal in the Senate, and the House, and Senator Hirono in the Senate have introduced the Lifting Immigrant Families Through Benefits Access Restoration. I promise there is an abbreviation called Lift the Bar Act. And it would restore access to federal benefits like healthcare, food assistance, housing, and income supports without a 5-year waiting period. And the bill also clarifies that DACA recipients, TPS holders, survivors of serious crimes or childhood abuse and neglect, or any other person with federal authorization to be in the US would also be eligible for these benefits without having to wait 5 years. And lastly, I just wanted to mention, the bill prohibits states and localities from adding more restrictions to immigrant access to benefits. So Lift the Bar would be the new floor, but it does allow benefits, states and localities more flexibility to create more inclusive programs, so to create a higher ceiling. So these proposals are important first steps towards a world where every child and family can meet their needs regardless of their immigration status. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And I guess I'm not seeing any questions. I'll get us started with an additional question I have for you all. So you've all spoken about the different areas, right? On the border and the interior enforcement, and then access to benefits, especially during these uncertain times. Can you speak about why it is so important to continue to push for federal policy change, and what can state and local children's advocates and providers do to help make that push? So this is a question for all of you all. Maybe we can start with Bilal again.
Thank you so much. I think you know, it can seem tiring, and it can seem like we're not able to push the needle enough. But one thing I want people to remember is that the other side is just so loud, so coordinated. And when, you know, a senator or some elected leader proposes some kind of anti-immigrant, anti-asylum, anti-refugee legislation, they will get so much feedback from their supporters saying, yes, thank you, you know, keep them out. And then on our side, when someone proposes something about restoring asylum and restoring and you know, centering the dignity of immigrant children, they don't hear as much from us. And so we need to be just as loud as the other side and say, this is the country that we want to be, right? It's not, at the end of the day, this isn't about policies. This isn't about, you know, legislation. It's about the kind of country that we want to be. Do we want to help people who need a little bit of help? Do we want to protect people who need safety? I believe yes, and I know that the people on this call do, yes. And so we need to be just as loud, if not louder, to say that. And obviously, one way to do that is through this kind of advocacy.
Thank you, Bilal. Carolina, do you want to go next?
Sure, thank you for the question, Juan. I agree with Bilal. It's a very strong narrative shift that we all are facing. And as you know, language informs policy inevitably. So to me is, what can I do as a person that I may care for immigrants or may care for their families or for the children? I think to me is first attending, you know, panels and summits like this where you can learn the information and actually be able to fight back that misinformation that you are receiving, maybe from a family member, from a neighbor, or from a community member, and take that time to have that one-on-one with that person. We've done a lot of research in the border right after Operation Lone Star and how people are really feeling, and it turns out that the fear of invasion, right, comes from not knowing how the system actually works, and comes from just not hearing maybe or being exposed to the stories, the humane stories, you know, of our immigrants, of migrants. So I think it takes all of us to be sharing the knowledge and to be collectively increasing awareness of our issues for people to understand why is it that people continue to come and take the risk to cross not through or not do it the right way, right, or whatever, because there is no right way right now. Our system does not allow that, and people are desperate. So I think taking that time to have a one-on-one with a family member, with a neighbor who is fearful, but who's also super misinformed, I think it's one step that you can take as an advocate or as someone who cares at a very personal level. And the more that we do it, the more opportunity that we will have to really change this narrative that is like the law says so loud, but so dehumanizing and so harming.
Thank you, Catalina. And Miriam, do you want to close us out on this question?
Yeah, I echo what my fellow panelists have said. And when it comes to access to benefits, Wendy said it so perfectly in her opening statement. Children across the country all need the same thing. They need good mental and physical health care. They need good nutrition. They need safe and stable housing. They need income support to meet their needs. And having that access early in life supports their success today, and it also supports their success as adults. And so federal policy should ensure that all children have those supports, regardless of their immigration status. And so, as I mentioned, the Biden administration will be releasing their final rule and will need help communicating that rule to communities across the country. And you as state and local advocates know your communities best and know what languages, what mediums, what materials that you need to reach these families. And you can recommend those to the government. And you can also document what's happening in your communities. As I mentioned, this rule is not going to be perfect. And I think all the documentation that's happened over the past few years were really helpful in being able to make the argument for a better rule. And so I think documenting where the rule falls short will be really important for future advocacy. And then in Congress, as I mentioned, the Lift the Bar Act has been introduced. Bilal has said it so perfectly that honestly, like, members of Congress don't want to hear from me. I'm in Washington, I'm a child advocate. They want to hear from constituents. They want to hear from you. They want to hear about the children in your district, in your state, in your community. And so you can call your representative or senator or ask to meet with them and their staff and ask them, are you a sponsor of the Lift the Bar Act? And if you're not, ask them to do it. We at First Focus, we have a fact sheet on the bill and how it would benefit children, and the Children Thrive Action Network actually has state-by-state fact sheets about how many children would benefit from lifting the 5-year waiting period. So you can use those statistics, but also your own state and local expertise to help members of Congress understand that all children, and when we say all children, we mean all children, should have access to what they need regardless of their immigration status.
Thank you, Miriam. And I see we have 2 more minutes, but there is a question in the Q&A I'd like to ask here. So Roselia writes, the Convention on the Rights of the Child was written in 1989 by member states of the UN, including the US. It speaks to the rights of refugees, children without families, protection from trafficking, and many others. There's 54 articles. To date, the US is the only member state that hasn't ratified it. Do any of you know of any push for its ratification? There's currently a child-friendly cities initiative within some cohort cities, Houston being one of them, where Roselia lives and is involved with the initiative and is not being impressed with what is being done right now. So maybe Miriam, would you like to take this question?
Sure. And Bilal and Carolina, I'd love to hear from you guys too. But yes, you are completely right, Roselia, that we are the only country in the entire world that has not ratified this treaty. And this treaty would deal with a lot of what we're saying, right? In terms of what it means for refugee children who are coming to the border, what it means for family unity when families arrive at the border and keeping them together, what it means for keeping families together here in our country. And so I think the road to ratification is really an uphill battle because you need 60 votes in the Senate. And right now it's just really, really hard to get those votes. That being said, there are a lot of people advocating for the principles of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, even though it hasn't been ratified. So for example, there are people pushing for a best interest of the child standard so that when the government makes every policy, they have to ask, how will this impact child safety? How will this impact family unity? How will this impact the child's access to services? There are initiatives to get high-level leadership either in the White House or independent high-level leadership like a commissioner, someone whose sole job is to look at the legislature and the executive branch and say, is this good for kids? And also someone, honestly, I think one of the barriers, one of the big issues that we have in child advocacy is not listening to kids themselves, right? There is no mechanism in federal policymaking for us to sit down and consult with kids about what's going on in their communities and to learn from that, from their lived experience. And so, for example, a commissioner or an office on children in the White House could hire people whose sole job it is to say, what do the kids in our country need? And to sit down with not just the 18 and 17-year-olds, but with the 5-year-olds and say, what's happening in your school? What is it that you need? So there are ways to get at the Convention of the Rights of the Child and the principles in it, even if we don't ratify it. But I completely agree that ratification is huge, especially for that international accountability that it would give and the pressure it would put on the United States.
I know we're at time or about at time, but I just want to see Bilal or Carolina, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? All right, if not, then I just want to thank our panelists again. Thank you so much for being a part of this panel and everyone for tuning in. And I'll pass it back to Guadalupe. Thank you all.
Thank you. Wow, what a conversation. Thank you all for this robust and informative discussion. It's fascinating to understand the intersection between the criminalization of forced migration, the atrocities of detention and immigration enforcement, and the exclusion to access to basic needs, and how it ultimately undermines safety and stability for immigrant children and family unity in our communities here at home. And now, I'd like to introduce our next session today on basic needs that immigrant children and families are facing. And we know they're facing barriers to healthcare, stable housing, food insecurity, and the deep implications for our communities here at home, just as the previous panel talked through. This session will explore how communities are organizing for innovative strategies and policies at the state and local level, with a commitment to access and support for immigrant children and families, for all children and families, regardless of status, from which we can learn and elevate a proposed framework for state, regional, and federal shifts that lead to creating healthy and safe communities. Moderating this discussion on basic needs is Viviana Westbrook, a state and local advocacy attorney with Clinic. Joining her for this conversation is Betzabel Estudillo, senior advocate with Nourish California, formerly California Food Policy Advocates, Jasmine Rangel, research specialist with Eviction Lab, and Jesse Mandel, deputy director with Senior Health Policy and Senior Health Policy Analyst with Voices for Utah Children. Could you all join us on camera? And Viviana, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Guadalupe. It is an honor to be moderating this panel that is covering such an important and timely issue around access to healthcare, stable housing, and food security for immigrant children and families. Since the start of the pandemic, challenges that immigrants previously experienced have been further highlighted as well as exacerbated. The impacts of excluding certain immigrants from our social safety nets has never been more apparent. To highlight this, I want to share a story about a client I had at the start of the pandemic. This client called me out of the blue one day. This was before vaccines, and I couldn't hear her because she could barely talk. She was in the emergency room in the hospital, and she was terrified. Now, she wasn't terrified for her life, although of course she was worried, but she was more than anything scared because she couldn't pay for rent for that month. She also was scared about how she was going to cover the hospital bills if and when she got out. And also, most importantly at that time, was that her 3 children were at home with no food in the fridge. You know, she didn't have any savings. She didn't have health care. She didn't have a safety net that would be able to support her. Luckily, I worked for an organization at that time, Tahrir Justice Center, which they have a legal team, but they also have like a social worker team. And together we were able to provide her family with what they needed. And we also tapped into some of the community resources, such as there was this LRJC group that was basically getting money together for immigrant families to be able to help provide for their basic needs. And it was only through this amazing work that we were able to provide my client with the help she needed, what her family needed in order to get them through that very difficult time. But something that always stuck with me is, wondering how many immigrants were in similar situations, but with less favorable outcomes because, they weren't in an area where people could respond as quickly. So there are many inequities faced by immigrant families in these areas, including barriers to access, which presents a number of challenges and the need for policy solutions. We've seen how non-citizens make up a large percentage of essential workers, that a lack of health insurance affects the undocumented population more than those with lawful status, and how other factors such as low wages, limited English proficiency, overcrowding, lack of sick leave, unemployment insurance, and hazard pay also contribute to immigrants' health outcomes. Since the start of the pandemic, food insecurity has risen by a historic amount. Significant racial disparities in food insecurity, which existed before COVID-19, remain in the wake of the pandemic. Undocumented immigrants and others seen as not qualified under the 1996 welfare law cannot avail themselves as many benefits such as SNAP, non-emergency Medicaid, public housing, SSI, TANF, the access to the affordable care marketplace, unless individual states pass legislation to open up the ACA, which has happened in several locations. But it's also important to note that many immigrants without social security numbers are still paying taxes by using individual taxpayer identification numbers or ITINs. And so they are paying billions of dollars into Social Security and Medicare each year, but they're not receiving any benefits from that. And that includes unemployment or any of the stimulus checks that were provided during this time since the pandemic started. So, for the immigrants who can receive federal benefits, many don't use them. We were previously talking in the last panel about public charge, but unfortunately, because of the changes that happened during the Trump administration, even though those changes aren't in place anymore, the fear is still remaining. And, the fear that they're going to be penalized if they use them abides, and they still don't want to actually register for these benefits. So it's a lot easier to shy away from accessing any benefits at all, rather than muddling through what feels like a very nebulous, frequently changing arena. But despite all these exclusions, which have left immigrant communities, which are already a vulnerable group with even more vulnerabilities, we still see some good happening. School breakfast and lunch programs are open to all children, regardless of immigration status. Almost every state provides access to WIC, that's a special supplemental nutrition program for women, infants, and children. And we have seen civil society respond to the need. In the last 2 years, we have seen an unprecedented amount of legislation, grants, and other creative efforts at the state and local level to fill the housing, healthcare, and food needs. Nonprofits, faith groups, local governments, and so many others have come together to try and cover the enormous need. So today we'll be hearing from experts on what policies and actions have been taken at the federal, state, and local level on these issues. So let me start with Jasmine. We know that the pandemic had a significant impact on housing for children and families. Can you speak to the specific challenges that immigrant children and families have faced from this? Are there federal or state policies that help address some of these concerns? What more needs to be done?
Sure. Thank you so much, everyone, for the opportunity to speak here today, and to Viviana for the great introduction to the topics that we're going to speak to today. I can't wait to learn from everyone else here at this discussion and the rest of the day at the summit. But to answer your question, Viviana, I need to provide a little bit more context as to what I can speak of, specifically based off of the most recent research we've been digging into lately at the Eviction Lab. My research partner, Lillian Lung, and I were able to conduct an interview study of about 30 renters within the Gulfton neighborhood of Houston, Texas. And in this neighborhood, and most of those we talked to, it is and has been for a few decades now a predominantly working class, low income community of Latinos, many of whom are also undocumented. So most of my reflections for today will come from the lessons that we learned there and might not be perfectly applicable to other subsets of immigrant communities, especially given how diverse immigrant communities are today and how much their needs vary. But from what we saw in the Gulfton neighborhood before the pandemic, families were often making a dangerous trade-off to maintain the stability of their relatively affordable housing. And the pandemic ultimately ended up highlighting the severity of these trade-offs that immigrant families are constantly making and how precarious the stability of their housing actually is. But what do I mean by trade-off specifically? Well, because immigrant families are typically forced into a corner of the housing market, they're forced into really cheap housing because of either their income restraints, their employment or documentation limitations. They're often only able to afford some of the worst quality housing. Some of the homes of people that we talked to were infested with roaches. They had severe rat problems and other bugs like bed bugs. And even in some cases, we've seen black mold on the entrance of their apartments or in the walls of their units. And some of these families are also more likely to be doubled up with other family members or just are kind of facing some crowding issues with either both family members or non-family members in one unit. One family we met with had up to 6 people living in a 1-bedroom apartment. So that's kind of not a great state to live in with young kids trying to get some sleep so that they can go to school for the next day, or even just, getting enough alone time, some relaxation time in at the end of the day. It's kind of a precarious state, both inside the house. And like I was saying, this is a state that was happening before the pandemic. Once the pandemic hit, it was the same and even more drastic. Families were forced to stay indoors in these conditions day in and day out. Ultimately, they were experiencing this kind of like dueling health hazards, both inside their house and outside their homes. Where could they really turn for respite during such a strange time in our world? In addition, countless families that we talked to reflected and told us about how much the pandemic affected their ability to make rent because their hours or their entire jobs were cut during this time. And the precarity of employment in families at risk of not even having the very structure that was protecting them from the pandemic, they were at risk of being completely unhoused and facing the violence that comes from being forcibly displaced, such as an eviction or even in some cases an informal eviction, just families leaving. But ultimately, this instability trickles down to children who bear the highest costs for the rest of their lives. This housing instability is affecting their economic, educational, and health outcomes. But during the pandemic, there were some interventions that were made on behalf of the federal and state governments and local governments. Federal policies like the third stimulus check expanded the eligibility of families across the country, and it often sometimes included immigrant families who could receive the third stimulus check. National emergency rental assistance funds and the CDC moratoriums all helped to keep people housed while they got back on their feet. And in various other states, local moratoriums and the delivery of emergency rental assistance that also had expanded eligibility requirements that included undocumented families was key to ensuring stable housing during this time. But for some families who were stressed about their ability to maintain a roof over their head, they still felt the pressure to seek assistance from wherever they could and often utilize their own networks to survive. Some folks tell us that they even spent days looking for resources and calling numbers that they weren't really sure who the number belonged to or what the organization was. But one thing that did help during this time was how key social infrastructures like schools, churches, and community groups got the word out about either free food events that were happening, clarifying the eligibility requirements of assistance programs, or even just events for kids so that they could be kids and enjoy themselves, right? But many families still went without during this time and had a hard time getting through the pandemic because of the difficulties they had in either accessing information needed for the resources they had to keep a roof over their head, or even they were confused about how to navigate processes like evictions or fighting an eviction in court when they ultimately got too behind on rent. And Viviana, you asked about what more needs to be done, and there's a lot more that needs to be done. But I think one thing that I took away from that experience and the stories that we heard was that continued thoughtful and consistent community outreach is critical to making sure that families know their rights, whether it be their rights as tenants or as laborers, and to make sure that the word is constantly getting out about opportunities and supportive services that are available to families. This continued presence is so critical for building trust and constantly understanding what's happening in immigrant families and immigrant communities, especially since there's such little data and systemic information about the conditions of particularly immigrant housing needs. And I'll stop there for now.
Well, thank you so much, Jasmine, both for your work, your research, such important information. I'm sorry. So now let's turn to Betsy. Betsy, many states have stepped up with support from federal dollars to provide critical support to needs such as food, nutrition. How has California responded to the increase in food insecurity, and what more still needs to be done?
Yeah, hi, good morning, everyone. It's so glad to be here. I'm a little bit under the weather, so if I sound a little weird, you know why. But it's so good to be here and to talk about a topic that is very dear to my heart. So, food insecurity remains to be a big issue in California. The pandemic and the economic crisis, and the one I think we're heading into again, is shed a light to food insecurity because it exacerbated the issue. And immigrant communities were or are among the hardest hit. California has the largest economy in the US. We have, I think, the 5th largest economy in the world. And yet we have the nation's highest poverty rate. And this has been for many years. And that to me is truly shocking, knowing how resourceful and how much abundance we have in our state. And this experience of deep hardship and issue around food insecurity and poverty is especially true for immigrant families, which in our state, we have about 2.3 million, approximately 2.3 million undocumented families, people in our state. So actually our organization and the California Immigrant Policy Center partnered with the UCLA Center for Health Policy Research to publish a brief that actually found that California's undocumented immigrants, among California's undocumented immigrants, more than 2 in 5, or about 45% of undocumented immigrants are affected by food insecurity. And those rates of food insecurity are actually acute for children, with nearly 2 out of every 3 undocumented children affected by food insecurity. And that truly is shocking. Again, because our state has so much abundance, so many resources, and we shouldn't be having this issue. And so one of the things that our state is doing and advocates are pushing is to prioritize this issue and address food insecurity among all Californians, but especially with our immigrant communities, given now the recent inflation and increase in food costs. In 2021, California made some key investments, which included funding for universal school meals. So soon, all children in California who attend a public school will receive a free breakfast and lunch. It also increased capacity in our regional and local food banks, bringing in more resources, knowing that food banks are one of the very few resources that undocumented people have for accessing food. It also included funding for system readiness to provide food assistance for undocumented immigrants, and I'll talk about that a little later. And with our Food for All campaign. And our state has also leveraged some federal flexibilities that have made it way easier for our residents to apply for CalFresh and WIC, such as just like applying online and getting on the automatic interview, online signature. And so all those things have made it much easier for our residents to apply. But we've been advocating for more. We know that the need is greater. We are actually looking to ensure how these flexibilities remain in place following this public health crisis. They've been working for our state, and so we want to make sure they remain. We're also looking to move equitable policies that would provide food assistance to all Californians, regardless of immigration status. And that's our Food for All campaign. In fact, right now, we're waiting for our governor to sign our 2022-2023 state budget any day now. Actually, could be literally any day. He has until the end of the month to sign a state budget. And there are a number of proposals that we're hoping that will get funded. We're actually expecting some funding for Food for All that would provide state food assistance to undocumented immigrants 55 and older. We're also expecting maybe potentially some free meals for childcare, for children in childcare settings, and fair pay for childcare providers, following the great work we did around universal school meals, and just other investments that will help mitigate poverty in our state and address food insecurity among immigrant communities. So, our work continues. Again, I think one of our major campaigns is going to be the Food for All campaign, which we're expecting that to be signed. But I'll share a little bit more later in the presentation. Thank you.
No, thank you, Betsy, for all your work in California, and good luck with Food for All campaign and everything else. Finally, Jesse, tell us about access to healthcare. We know it's still a challenge for immigrant children and families. What are local and state policy solutions that can help meet this need where the federal government hasn't? And what more can still be done?
Thank you so much. And my apologies, I'm having connectivity issues, as of course always happens at moments you wish it wasn't. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and to speak with you about this. And I appreciate being here. I should also add that I'm here on behalf of my colleagues here at Alvarez Valle with Voices for Utah Children. She was not able to join today, but we work together at Voices for Utah Children here in Salt Lake City and across the state on issues related to children's access to coverage and care. So I'm very excited to talk about the work that's happening here in Utah and some of the other state and local efforts that we've been watching and working with other states on, and hope that might be something that could be taken advantage of while we wait for federal action. Here in Utah, we have been spearheading a campaign called the 100% Kids Campaign and Coalition. And this is a campaign dedicated to covering all kids regardless of immigration status. Utah has one of the highest rates of uninsured children in the nation, and also one of the highest rates of Hispanic or Latino children and kids that are eligible for programs like Medicaid and CHIP, but not currently covered. So taking all those various data points, we launched the campaign in 2019, really to lift up the need to reach all kids regardless of status, and also bring in kids that we know are eligible right now, but might not be enrolling because we are under the effect of the public charge and other policies, as was mentioned. And launching the campaign to Coverage for All Kids, we received a lot of support from a variety of folks, and brought a lot of people into our coalition. But then in 2021, we actually ran a bill here in the Utah State Legislature to cover all children, and then ran it again in 2022. And while I guess I kind of gave you the preview that we had to run it twice, it has yet to pass here, but we have seen incredible support for Coverage for All Kids. And so here we're seeking to join a handful of other states that have already taken action to use state funds to help all kids get covered by Medicaid and CHIP, regardless of their immigration status. And we saw tremendous support here in Utah. While it did pass through our conservative Senate, where a Republican supermajority, that had a lot of support. And I think that speaks to the ways that basic needs, kids' healthcare really can resonate with some lawmakers. And so we actually feel hopeful that this bill is going to continue to move forward and get some traction. So I'm going to throw in our link when I'm done in the chat, so you can see a link to our coalition page. But we have seen a lot of success around trying to push for using state dollars to cover kids all who are eligible for because of income, but just not because of immigration status through Medicaid and CHIP. And we hope to join a handful of states that have taken that option. A few other policies, though, I do just want to flag. One is that a few years ago, Utah was successful in removing the 5-year bar for children. And so that was also something that we did receive pretty wide support among a very conservative legislature. And we were able to do so by taking advantage of some higher match rates under CHIP. And that did, of course, make it easier because the fiscal piece is always an uphill battle in states like Utah. But we have yet to remove the 5-year bar for pregnant individuals. And so that's an area where we do hope to continue to make progress, because it's great that kids no longer have to wait 5 years, but we know that a lot of pregnant individuals are still left out. And that's another area where we also would like to see, we know that some states are already starting to make progress on ensuring that all pregnant individuals, regardless of status, are getting covered. And we've explored some state options over the years and worked with folks in reproductive justice and others to look at what are the options here in Utah. And there are federal policy options available to states to take advantage of. And I think it's just weighing the risks and benefits for your state to try and move forward with them. But would like to see more progress, because we think that in a conservative state like Utah, there's still some openness to at least covering kids and pregnant individuals. And then one other thing I do just want to mention is that while we are working at the state level, there's also, with our state legislature, there's still progress to be made at the administrative level and even with our local entities. And so in the end, while our Coverage for All Kids bill did not pass this past legislative session, we're working with healthcare partners and large hospital systems to see if they can start to chip in, just like we've seen in states like in Oregon and California. Can they work at the local level? Can they help provide some funding for a pilot or fund an insurance program on their own? We know that when children get enrolled, it also ensures that it's a welcome effect, right? The eligible kids who are already receiving or could receive a federal match get enrolled too. And it's a huge benefit to our hospital system. So we want them to be partners in this and help see if they can support some local initiatives to cover all kids, while we also try for state Coverage for All Kids bills to pass. So thank you. I'm glad I was able to get through that without my computer fritzing out. I apologize for the panel heartbreak or stress I might have caused, but thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you so much, Jessie. And it's so wonderful to hear about the broad support for healthcare for children in Utah. Okay, so now I have a question for everyone on the panel. What can other state and local advocates and providers do to help push for not only federal policy change, but change at the state or local level as well? Jasmine, let's start with you again.
Sure. So I think one of the big things that I'd love to kind of put out there is that we just really need to start minimizing restrictions for assistance programs. And I think especially for housing assistance programs, when we know that housing is so deeply integral to everyone's future and is connected to each part of our lives, housing it's not great for anyone that's not undocumented, but it's even worse for folks that are undocumented, right? But then in the short term, continuing things like emergency rental assistance with the same expanded eligibility would be helpful when some families fall behind due to a medical emergency or a setback in hours, or especially for seasonal workers. Those would just be really great legs up for maintaining stability in a community. But I think broadly, we can't continue to overlook housing in conversations about basic needs in lieu of other interventions. So we're talking about housing insecurity, right, or food insecurity, and maybe a lapse in healthcare, but housing is kind of connected to everything, right? So I would encourage everyone to just continue, especially advocates, to continue bringing housing constantly into the conversation, because it's so intertwined to all of these different issues that immigrant families are facing.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. Betsy?
Yeah, so we're actually moving a Food for All campaign that I mentioned before, and that we're waiting the governor's signature to see what he'll include in our state budget. But for the past 2 years, we've been moving a statewide legislative and budget campaign in partnership with the California Immigrant Policy Center. The campaign is looking to provide state-funded food assistance to all immigrants in California, regardless of immigration status. So essentially that means that what we're trying to do is use our California Food Assistance Program, which is a state-funded program we created in response to welfare reform. In 1996, we created that program to provide food assistance to qualified immigrants that were excluded at the federal level. And we're looking to broaden that CFAP program to include many other immigrants, which include undocumented immigrants, but it also includes DACA recipients, temporary protected status, and also other visa holders. We've had some really great success, I would say, in the last 2 years, building upon some of the great work that our colleagues have done around expanding Medi-Cal, our state's Medicaid program, to undocumented immigrants. We have secured some funding last year that would essentially get our system ready and for expanding these benefits. And then this year, the governor allocated in his proposed budget plan funding to provide actual benefits, so CFAP, nutrition and food benefits, to immigrants 55 and older, meaning that soon California will be the first state in the nation to provide state-funded food assistance to undocumented immigrants 55 and older. We're very excited about that, and it just shows how we can be a leader, but we know that the need is greater, and we're going to continue to push. And right now, actually, we're preparing to get the momentum still going and get us prepared and re-strategize for our campaign next year, which will be looking at advocating to fully fund Food for All and have food assistance to all immigrants, regardless of immigration status or age. And we're very excited to do that. And I know that other states are looking to California, or actually looking to create their own Food for All campaigns. And we're just excited about that, making sure that other states also look at what's possible and making sure that all of the residents have access to food assistance.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Jesse.
Yeah, I mean, I know I talked a lot about some of the advocacy happening here at the state level, but I think there's other things that we have to continue to be doing too. And it was mentioned in the previous panel, but lifting up, I think, we do a lot around lifting up what's happening here at the local level, here in Utah, here in Salt Lake City, in our rural parts of our state, that this is something that we are all, that access to healthcare is something that we all need to be working on and focused on and talking about. And so we do a lot around how can we share our stories. We'll be releasing a digital storybook soon that that documents those stories of trying to find healthcare and the stresses that families face when a child or one sibling is unable to get healthcare, but also the successes when you are able to get Medicaid and CHIP. And so sharing those stories and lifting those up is a really important piece that that we then are able to try and use in our advocacy. And it really does make a difference. I think when we've just been talking with some of our legislators that just that I think they are, so the stories make a difference, and and I know the data points to, but I think when they hear the stories of families and they're able to identify with families and the experiences that different families are going through, we've been able to reach some legislators I didn't think we would. And then of course the other piece, in addition to documenting and sharing the stories, is just outreach. And I know this was mentioned too, but we do have to continue to get the word out about Medicaid and CHIP and the reasons that it's okay and safe to enroll a family, and to also respect when a family doesn't still feel safe, because here in a state like Utah, there's a lot of reasons that that I think, there's still some uphill battles that we're facing. But at the same time, getting the word out about Medicaid and CHIP, I always talk about, dental, and I know we're going to be talking about mental health. Those are all benefits that come with the program. And so working with a lot of different community partners to get the word out and combat the chilling effect is also going to be an important piece that we'll be continuing to work on.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. I do see that there is a question in the chat. Xochitl with Moms Rising, Mamas con Poder, had a question for Betsabe. Is the 45% of immigrant children who are food insecure are children in mixed status families?
Yeah, so this data that I mentioned earlier in my presentation, so the data shows that 45% of overall undocumented immigrants, which include adults, children, are affected by food insecurity. For children, it's actually 64% of undocumented children are impacted by food insecurity. So about 2 out of every 3. These are undocumented children, so they are part of mixed immigration status households. But and the data itself doesn't make a distinction of like, what does that look like? And the composition, they're just, and they take a certain question to identify their status. So, but it's inclusive of mixed immigration status households.
Thank you so much. We do have one question in the chat, but since we're out of time, I will just encourage the panelists to answer it in writing. And thank you, everyone. This has been such an honor.
Thank you all for this robust and informative conversation. As you all mentioned, it's important to highlight the federal policies of exclusion and what that looks like in our communities, and to learn how states and localities have the obligation to intervene on behalf of everyone, all children and their families, and how it's possible to do so despite the political diversity of our states. And now, I'd like to introduce our next session today on mental health. The COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated a mental health crisis in our country. Many individuals already face barriers to accessing mental health care, including costs, provider shortages, stigma related to mental health issues. Immigrant families face additional challenges to accessing care as a result of costs, ineligibility for insurance, and the linguistic and cultural issues when accessing mental health services. Given the disproportionate impact on the pandemic on the health and well-being of our immigrant communities and communities of color, this session will feature a discussion on mental health challenges facing immigrant communities and their children, and what healing looks like for our immigrant communities at this time. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Sergio Aguilar Gacciola, who will moderate this conversation today. Dr. Sergio is the director of the UC Davis Center for Reducing Health Disparities and the Clinical and Translational Research Center, CTSC. Joining him is Mulba Sumwe, Wellness Resource Coordinator with UndocuBlack, Catherine Hinshaw, Policy Manager with Justice for Migrant Women, and Dr. Evelyn Kwong, Board Certified Psychiatric Nurse Practitioner. Go ahead. I'm excited to hear this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guadalupe, and thank you for the organizers for this kind of invitation for this very important panel and the focus on youth mental health. I'm grateful also for the speakers, for those who are going to be addressing some of the questions that we have for them. But before I get into pass on the questions to the panelists, I would like to just emphasize how important this focus on youth mental health is. No question that the crisis, the pandemic crisis, and before the crisis has hit children on multiple fronts. Many have experienced social isolation during lockdowns, family stress, a breakdown of routine and anxiety about the virus. The kids experience school closures, remote teaching and learning interruptions, and it really has set back many at school, especially these are children from immigrant families. Some of the kids are immigrants themselves, certainly immigrant families. And what immigrant families have experienced as well is that some parents have had job and income losses, creating financial instability and exacerbating parental stress. And the other thing that we really need to address, at least to have in mind, is that thousands of kids have lost a parent or grandparent to COVID. So there are layers and layers of complexities that our immigrant families have gone through. And no question that COVID-19 has caused unprecedented disruption in the lives of kids, youth age 10 to 18 and younger, leading them experiencing increases in mental health concerns. And some of the things that have been documented, for example, is that kids are experiencing depression, anxiety. There has been an increase in substance abuse, but something that is very sobering and we need to really be concerned about is the increases in suicidal thoughts and behaviors. We do a lot of work with farm workers and their families and other immigrant populations. And I cannot tell you how often these things are emerging. Speak with frequency with promotoras and with providers. And what we are experiencing, the significant increase in suicidal thoughts and behaviors, especially from immigrant families. I'm quite familiar with what is happening with Latino families and other populations, to some extent Asian and Pacific Islanders and other immigrant groups. And personally, I have witnessed, in friends whose kids, twins, for example, 13 years of age, who one of them attempted suicide a couple of times. Sobering. And so this is a very important panel and an important focus. I'm happy to say that, among all of these gloomy things, that the current administration, the Biden administration, has made mental health a national priority. And I don't know if you have it in your radar, but the First Lady, Dr. Biden, had a recent conversation on youth mental health just this past few days. And she says, I'm going to read directly from her words. And over the last decade, an alarming number of young people have struggled with mental health challenges. And the pandemic has made it so much worse, hasn't it? You know, the isolation, the anxiety, and yes, the grief. They are wounds that sometimes go unseen, too often cloaked in secrecy and shame. So I can go on and on because I have tried to have a finger on the pulse of how the pandemia and before the pandemia, people of all ages are being impacted in their mental health, and especially children and youth. So I'm so heartened to see that we have a panel specifically focused on youth mental health. And with that, let me, Guadalupe already introduced the speaker. So if I can go directly to Muleda, and I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name appropriately, but I have a question for you. What is trauma-informed care, and why is this important to implement in services that directly work with the immigrant community? And then I have a follow-up question. And how does context play a role in understanding the needs of this community? Please.
Thank you so much for having me. Apologize for my voice. And you pronounced it perfectly. It is Maliba. I just wanted to say thank you for sharing and bringing the point of how important and how needed this conversation and this space is. So I'm grateful to be part of this, and I'm grateful for this space. To answer your question, trauma-based care is just the acknowledgement of the depth in which trauma affects an individual and those who care for them. And I think the important part is remembering the folks who are, that it includes folks who are professionals in the service of care, of that care for people, and they also need to be included in that, like how trauma affects them and re-triggers and all those things. And for the second part, I would say aftercare is so important in our community, in the work that we do, but it's often forgotten. How do we take care of ourselves? How do we raise to pull back from the reality of day to day of what we do and take a breather, to have that backbone and those resources to get support for specific needs of our community. Like you said, suicide rates are so high now in our communities because the lack of access to the resources to get that care, the barriers of judgment within our communities, the lack thereof of maybe transportation or knowing that you can get this information, you can get these resources. So I feel like aftercare resources and educating folks and members in our communities that these resources are available, and that just compassionate support, human support directly for our community needs is very important. And then just being aware and being present in the daily reality of our communities, that these mental health issues, these problems are actively real things that we deal with. So I feel like you need folks who are within our communities or understand, can be with us and know where we're coming from, the reality of our lives, and that way, so then they can direct, like that support and resources to that community.
Well, thank you so much, Moliva. Very well said. I appreciate the comprehensive answers. And now I'm going to go to Dr. Kwang. Evelyn, the question for you is, what should collaboration with the local community and resources look like? And then I have two follow-up questions. How can community partners and local, state, federal government work together to make sure these needs are met? And if I need to say the questions again, please let me know. Last question is, what types of policies are needed to help support these needs?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I actually, I think those questions are actually for Catherine. The ones that I think that are for me are, okay. Sorry, because I don't work in policy. I work a clinical capacity.
Yeah, you are right. I messed up, as simple as that.
Sorry.
So let me ask you the questions that are meant for you, Dr. Kwang. What are some of the unique mental health needs, concerns in the immigrant community? And then a follow-up, two follow-ups. What are some of the challenges in meeting the needs of this community, and how does generational trauma play a role?
Thank you. Thanks so much. Just for context, I'm currently working at the Charles B. McMillan Community Health Center, and this is a federally qualified health center in New York City, which focuses on the care of the Asian American community, a majority of which are immigrants. So I want to talk about a couple of the unique concerns that I've seen. So the first one is intergenerational transmission of trauma. And this refers to the epigenetic changes that are passed down from directly traumatized generations to their offspring. So often a lot of the immigrant community, sometimes refugees, they may be escaping, persecution, genocide, domestic violence, war, oppressive government regimes, and extreme poverty. And this can really take the form of toxic and traumatic stress. And parents are often, and families suffering from PTSD, depression, anxiety, and complex grief from the loss of culture, country, and separation or death of family members. And then in terms of epigenetic alterations, this can even purportedly start in the uterine environment. So you actually see changes in DNA methylation patterns that affect expression of genes, which can impact glucocortical levels like cortisol, which is one of our stress hormones. And this in turn can affect our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis regulation, which is our body's stress response system. And when it's dysregulated, that can look like be underactive, which looks like avoidance, isolation, shutting down, or sometimes can be overactive, which can look like hypervigilance, agitation, lashing out. And the second part of this transmission of trauma is also dealing with the post-traumatic state of a parent. This can take the form of toxic stress for children and adult children as well. So parents who are socially, emotionally, and behaviorally dysregulated, they imprint this on their kids. And then the children actually model after that. And this can lead to, risk and experience and exposure to things like domestic violence, attachment issues. There was a very large study done in the 90s with 17,000 adult participants on adverse childhood experiences. So the higher your score, like the more you've had, the different types you've had, right, it can really disrupt one's neurodevelopment, lead and places them at higher risk ultimately for things like, difficulty finding, retaining jobs, forming healthy relationships, health problems like cancer, diabetes, suicide, teen pregnancy, being trafficked. And then the second, another concern that I've seen a lot is the concept of the concern of parentification. So immigrants often will experience some downward social mobility. So they will lose their prior roles, jobs, licensure, and they have to start all over again here. And so children are also often, I see, asked and tasked to navigate the system for their families, whether it's through schools, applications, legal issues, medical appointments, and that's due to language barriers, gaps in knowledge, cultural barriers. They're often sometimes expected to help raise younger siblings. And sometimes children can be separated or raised by other family members, which can cause attachment issues between parents and their kids. And that kind of limited parenting, sometimes there can be limited parenting because parents are expected to work constantly to just make ends meet. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was comparative trauma and identity confusion. And the concept of my trauma is worse than yours. What I went through is you didn't go through war, poverty. How could you possibly experience stress here? You have a roof over your head, you have clothes on your back. So this can create a lot of guilt, shame, impaired self-esteem in children when their own emotions, needs, and experiences are just constantly minimized or ignored, and they can learn to ignore their own needs. And then with this also an enmeshed or fused identity with parents. So the kind of the pressure on kids to make their parents' sacrifice sort of worth it. So they might be pressured or guilted, shamed into doing what's expected of them that's considered stable, financially secure. And then what I find is that they don't often sometimes know who they are, what they like, what they really want to do. And they can't distinguish between their needs versus other people's needs. And this also, in addition to, is intertwined with navigating white supremacy, internalization of discrimination and racism. And then on top of recently with the pandemic, racial and, so much racial and gender-based violence in communities of color. This really leads to depression, anxiety, psychiatric disorders, chronic emptiness, poor sense of belonging. And then just some of the challenges in meeting those needs. I think I want to be mindful of the time. I feel like I'm maybe over my time.
Just briefly, but you are giving a very comprehensive and in-depth answers to the 3 questions. Very, very much appreciated.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to keep it brief. So just, even working on mental health can be seen as a luxury by immigrant families because some of them I see are working 6-7 days. They just don't have the time. So they really, they lack health insurance coverage, unsafe housing, poverty. They can't get better medications, sufficient childcare to just come for care. The stigma, as was mentioned earlier, just is so great. I often see with a lot of Asian American families, they don't come in for care until it's really bad, like really, really bad. They need to be hospitalized. And this is to save face or to the fear of authority figures or what their association is with authority in their country of origin too, right? If you're police, hospitals, deportation risk. And lastly, also just, I think the gap in understanding of trauma-informed care, there's no training for this in medical school, nursing school, social work, maybe more so in social work school. I can't speak to that, but there's really not like a standard curriculum, I think, for it. And we don't learn about the history of non-Western countries. And then like a lack of culturally fluent, like ethnic providers, particularly for pediatric mental health providers. You talked a lot about this. It's really a crisis, it's throughout the whole country. I mean, half of our referrals that we get are pediatric psych referrals. There's just not enough therapists or psychiatric providers to give them the kind of care that they need. And there's a lot of code switching that's involved with this work as well, which is exhausting, a lot of emotional cognitive labor. And I think that it's not to recruit and retain people is also a big issue, because the working conditions are often not good. Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you. Actually, is as I mentioned, a very comprehensive response, and indeed, it's a crisis. Back in October, the American Academy of Pediatrics and other organizations that have 77,000 members, they declare a child and youth mental health crisis. And so we have known this for quite some time now. And the problems continue to occur. And there is data that it seems to affect unequally, immigrant families and children of immigrant families as well. So I'm sorry to have perhaps raised your blood pressure a little bit, Dr. Kwang, by asking you the question that was meant for Catherine. So now let me ask the right question. Catherine, I have also 3 questions for you. What should collaboration with the local community and resources look like? How can community partners and local, state, federal government work together to make sure these needs are met? And what types of policies are needed to help support those needs?
Hi, thank you, and thanks to the panel here for all of the information that you've already shared. It's been really helpful, and I hope folks are taking care of yourselves during this conversation. It's a lot. So just a little bit of context: Justice for Migrant Women. We work to ensure that all migrant women can and their families can live and work with dignity. And so a lot of our work has engaged with the farm worker community, many of whom are immigrants, although we also work with other migrant workers who are not immigrants, but migrate, from state to state seasonally or otherwise for work or other reasons. So, that poses its own set of mental health challenges. But I just thought, just so you know, kind of where we're coming from on this. And I think to begin with the collaboration with local community, our work, it starts with listening. We last year partnered with several organizations to launch a program called Healing Voices, which was a pilot project that provided mental health services to farm workers, many of whom were parents. We worked with the National Migrant Seasonal Head Start Association to find families in Florida and in California who were interested in participating in the program. And really the way that began was through a town hall during COVID to check in on kind of what the needs were from the community. We didn't have a kind of this idea that we were going to launch Healing Voices going into the town hall. But what we heard consistently from parents and from families was that mental health was at stake, and that it wasn't anything new, but that COVID had definitely exacerbated it, which is something, everyone's been talking about here today. And so we partnered, like I mentioned, with the National Migrant Seasonal Head Start Association, as well as Latinx Therapy and the Eva Longoria Foundation to create a program that would provide mental health services to two farm workers kind of working to fill a gap that we identified. And we learned a lot from this. I think one of the main things being that a healing space in this sort of collective model was really beneficial for folks, and to be able to connect with each other, and then also to build power. You know, it wasn't just, it was focused on healing and kind of looking at personal and community trauma, but then also with the goal of ultimately to build agency so that the folks in the group could kind of feel like they could step into their power and then move forward with some of the solutions that they're seeing that are needed in the community. So it was kind of a dual purpose. And, you know, I think we confirmed what we thought would be true, what folks have mentioned here today, that barriers to accessing mental health included cost and accessibility, particularly in rural communities. So a lot of the migrants that we work with and the families are in rural communities. And also things like childcare were barriers. You know, we had folks who wanted to participate, but and you know, these were virtual groups as well. So you know, it was really, we were really trying to be accessible, as accessible as we could, especially during a pandemic. But you know, even the challenges exist of being able to take care of your children while doing a sort of support group as this did exist. So and then even just, you know, not feeling like there was time in the day, right? As was, I think, both my other panelists have mentioned. So this was a pilot project. We still have this sort of long-term goal of scaling this and supporting essential workers in a variety of sectors, particularly those who are migrants, particularly those who are low paid. And I think one of the things that we kind of learned through this is it also provides an opportunity to connect with officials, elected officials, appointed officials at different levels of government to make the case why this is so needed and so important. So, you know, these aren't services that the government is providing in a very accessible way to the communities that we're serving. And so we're exploring what it would look like to have a mental health standard that would be enforced by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And we're working with the Department of Labor currently to make sure that they're connected with folks on the ground on this issue. You know, standards are not easy to come by. We could not even get a complete emergency temporary standard for physical health during COVID-19 for all essential workers. So, you know, we're just sort of beginning to explore what this could look like, but it is a priority for the Department of Labor. You know, the Secretary of Labor himself is very open about his own challenges with mental health. And we most recently held a virtual summit with the Secretary of Labor and the Director of the Women's Bureau, Wendy Cervantes, where we were able to have her in conversation with several migrant women workers who had experienced mental health challenges during the COVID pandemic. So kind of from there, our next steps are going to be a community survey where we're going to connect with families on this issue and try to get a little bit more data on the things that we're looking at. And also, you know, just recognizing that the physical and mental health can't be looked at independently from each other, and knowing that there's systems in place that are specifically intended to fail the communities that we work with. And so it requires providing solutions to address the physical needs, you know, the things that we had mentioned earlier in the federal policy panel around pathway to citizenship and living wages, as well as kind of accompanying that with the mental health support.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine. Excellent responses, you know, very deep responses from the three of you. And time has gone by so quickly, my goodness. I have a final question for the three of you. And we have only about 6-7 minutes. So if you can, you know, tell us briefly your thoughts about this particular question. Are there any pieces of federal, local, state legislation that are addressing any of these concerns? And what can advocates at the state and local level do to help? Let me start with you, Catherine, and then I'll go to Dr. Kwang and then to Muliba.
Thanks. Yeah, I will kind of briefly mention a couple of things. You know, I mentioned the standard as something we're exploring and working with the administration to see kind of what they can do for parents and families. Also, the Lift the Bar Act has been discussed throughout this session. And I think, you know, any sort of policies that would expand access to Medicaid and other healthcare benefits. And, you know, it's kind of like two-tiered, like ensuring that mental health is a part of that, as a part of healthcare, and then ensuring that the communities that we work with have access to the healthcare. So kind of policies that Lift the Bar Act that would reduce those barriers are definitely important kind of things to keep in mind as it relates to advocacy. I also wanted to mention that there are a lot of kind of state and local initiatives and some unlikely partnerships. So the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services recently rolled out an initiative aimed at helping agricultural workers of all kinds connect with mental health resources. So they launched, I don't know if folks may be familiar with this, but they launched a multilingual 24-hour helpline. And it's kind of providing farm workers and farmers personalized support in their local communities, which is kind of an interesting, I guess, collaboration, if you will. So I think the importance of looking at some of these common threads and with other communities and maybe some of those unlikely partnerships. You know, one of the things we learned in the Healing Voices was that one of the participants shared that, you know, she recognized her challenges were maybe unique to her, but that others had different challenges that were kind of equally as valid. So kind of being able to build off that in community and then communicate that to policymakers at all levels of government, I think it is an effective approach.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for those resources. Actually, I'm going to look into them because there is such a need, as you mentioned, with farm worker families. Let me go now to Evelyn. Any thoughts about these two questions? And please be brief because we are about to finish.
Okay. I think one of the scholarships and loan repayment for any kind of like mental health training, and I know Grace Mung has the Mental Health Workforce and Language Access Act that is promoting that, just implementing trauma-informed care curriculums. And then I think any policies that really fund and expand community center services to kind of serve as these ethnic enclaves. You can provide like anti-bullying programming there, book clubs, movie screenings that are run by like ethnic staff, creates opportunity for connection and like healed community-based healing. This kind of acts as a protective or buffer against a lot of the adverse childhood experiences. And I'm gonna leave it at that.
Okay. Well, thank you so much again. And Muliba, you are muted.
Sorry about that.
No
I said you both mentioned some very important things. To the best of my knowledge, no, as far as legislation in place. I hope that, you know, in the future we'll have more legislation and the system in place that will build to actually serve our communities rather than keep us out on issues that, you know, impact our disparities. I hope that there's more intentional push for mental health and awareness, care, resources, trainings, more education, and, you know, just us doing the work to get those that information passed on to our communities. The ask and the push is that people advocate at a local level as much as possible, as much and as far as possible, because having that legislation, even just at a county level, is huge and it has a lot of impact. And those seemingly small wins will truly have a ripple effect for all. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I appreciate it. There is a wealth of information that you provided. I cannot believe how much information in the little time that we have available that was already shared. So I'm very grateful to the three of you and also honored to have served as the moderator. And if I can only say that the Biden administration, as part of the national mental health investment that they are doing, just to mention that the 23 fiscal year budget has over 27 billion in discretionary funding and another 100 billion in mandatory funding over 10 years to implement the national strategy. And this is with the intention to really address the issues that we discuss here. And I know that there are states like California also with the Children and Youth Behavioral Health Initiative, $4 billion for this particular year that is going to span for 5 years. This is a step in the right direction, but we collectively need to make it happen to protect our kids and our youth, especially in immigrants and immigrant families. And with that, let me pass this on to Guadalupe. Thank you so much, Guadalupe.
Thank you, Dr. Sergio, for moderating such an amazing discussion. We could talk about mental health in our immigrant communities for hours. It was an honor to hear from each of you share your wealth of information. Muleba, you spoke on the importance of taking care of ourselves and taking care of each other. Dr. Evelyn, you talked about the impacts of generational harm and trauma, and highlighting the importance of centering trauma-informed care's culturally specific care. And Catherine's really highlighting those unlikely partnerships and creative solutions that have to happen in our communities, in our regions, in our homes. And while we build those systems of care, right, like Muleba said, the importance of empowering our communities to care for ourselves and each other. With that, I'm excited to transition to our next session on education. Access to a K-12 education for all children, regardless of immigration status, is a right that was established in 1982 in the Plyer v. Doe Supreme Court ruling. The Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, and other state policy efforts have helped expand access to education for undocumented students in post-secondary education. We, along with our partners across the country, celebrated the impacts of Plyer v. Doe and DACA in our communities last week with the anniversaries of Plyer and DACA. This session will feature a new episode by Rational Middle that highlights the importance of educational equity for immigrant students and families, as well as a conversation with the producers. To get started, let's cut to the episode.
Public education is really important for all of us because it makes sure that access to a basic education is not a privilege of the few, but is actually available to all children in our society.
Every child is a resource, and our role as educators is to try to help them flourish and become the best human beings they can be.
When we invest in our kids, when we invest in their education, we help make them better workers in the future, and that helps their future productivity and in our future prosperity.
What we want is every person to do the best they can and to learn to collaborate with one another and see themselves working towards a shared fate as a nation. Whether we do it well or not will have deep implications for the country.
The 1982 lawsuit, Plyer versus Doe, ruled that all students have the right to attend school in the U.S. No matter whether they're undocumented or legal immigrants or U.S. citizens, every child has the right to go to school. The state of Texas was arguing that it was going to cost money to educate undocumented immigrants. And the Supreme Court said that any money that they save is actually lost when we don't have educated citizens. And so it's not worth the savings, in fact, to not educate students.
And that was really based on the principle that education is fundamental to maintaining the fabric of our society, and that if children that were undocumented are denied an access to an education, then they would actually make up a permanent underclass, and it would really foreclose any opportunity for them to contribute to our nation in the future. The fact is that when we have the right supports and services available to them in schools, they are able to succeed and do really well. But it does require schools to be flexible and to be able to address those specific needs.
Building the infrastructure for supporting the students, for supporting the parents, for providing language access is really very time and resource intensive.
Generally in our classrooms, we don't have enough bilingual teachers or counselors or administrators who are able to communicate with kids or their parents in their language. And for kids who are unaccompanied and have recently arrived, many of them have already dealt with a lot of trauma. They may have missed many years of schooling as part of their journey here, or just have less formal education in general. So they technically have a lot of catching up to do. And so what we really need to do is be making sure that we invest in that system so that it's really meeting the needs of our students and realizing their full potential.
At the end of the day, we really want to provide the opportunities for folks to be able to sustain themselves, their families, and their communities. And for those that are left behind in the K-12 system or in high school, that makes it exponentially harder for them to have those types of successes. Even though there's a guaranteed education at the K-12 level for undocumented immigrants, that guarantee does not extend to higher education. Some states explicitly pass laws to prohibit undocumented immigrants from even attending higher education. Other states have open enrollment for undocumented students, but may make them pay out-of-state tuition, even though if those individuals were U.S. citizens, they would qualify for in-state tuition because they live in those states and their families have established residency and their families have paid property and state taxes. In terms of the most progressive states like California, we have the opening up of scholarships and financial aid on top of in-state tuition availability. For the states that have opened their doors to undocumented immigrants in the higher ed context, there has been a bevy of benefits. And these universities and colleges are aggressively competing for student enrollment because it is a net positive gain for them.
The Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program that was instituted under the Obama administration helped address some of the barriers that undocumented students face. One, because it gave them access to legal status and to work permits. When you look at Dreamers, there is a perfect example of how investing in our kids and investing in the education and the opportunity of every child can really have great benefits for us. DACA recipients are going to college, working as teachers, doctors in our hospitals and our schools, as engineers and Fortune 500 companies. The fact that they had access to an education has shown us what can happen if we really believe in every child and give them the opportunity.
We have a dynamic of 100,000 undocumented immigrants graduating from high school in the United States every year. Many of those individuals are not eligible for DACA because DACA had a cutoff. As an undocumented immigrant without DACA or other forms of protection, you don't have a work permit, you don't have a driver's license, you don't have an ability to consistently make an economic living.
Students who are in high school and then find out that they might not be able to attend college, that's very distressing and disappointing for them, and that can often lead to them dropping out of high school.
For the people that drop out or do not have the support to be able to do those things successfully, what we're really going to see is not earn as much as their peers, to not have available the careers that they want, to not be able to support their families, to not be able to expand the tax base or grow our nation's GDP.
In other words, we lose out on all of the contributions that individual could have made had they had the opportunity to realize their full potential.
At the end of the day, immigration protections are interrelated with economic security, which are related to the ability to thrive and succeed. We need to provide some sort of protection for undocumented immigrant students, especially for those that fall outside of DACA.
I've learned in this work that there are ultimately people who just fundamentally disagree with paying for things like a public education or really any public system. But for those people who understand that a return on investment can mean increased productivity, all you really have to do is look at the numbers and realize that if we have 25% of the child population, which is what children of immigrants are, not having an access to an education or a high quality education, we are setting ourselves up for a really bleak future.
When we think about education as a public good, as something that belongs to all of us, it becomes a little bit easier to understand why we want to ensure that all students are able to take part. Even students who get a degree and then get a job and raise a family and then they teach their kids and their kids have a really strong work ethic, that's a benefit to society too.
At its very core, education is going to be an investment, a promise that our youth in the future will be able to take part in our economy, contribute to their communities, and take care of their families. Every dollar in the context of education that we send out comes back to us multiplied in a wide variety of ways, whether that's a new business that gets started, a career path that gets fulfilled, a community that is able to have better economic outcomes. When you seek to strip education from undocumented students, at the end of the day, you're frankly just shooting yourself in the foot.
And that is going to put us in a really bad place if we're having to invest in supporting that segment of the population. So it's always better to invest in kids, and the research shows what long-term outcomes are. If we can ensure that every single child, regardless of their immigration status, their race, where their parents came from, has the opportunity to be the very best that they can be, that's the safest bet we can make as a country.
Today, we live in a world where the returns to education remain the greatest investment a society can make. It is education that gives the tools, the sensibilities, the competencies for the next generation. In the here and now, you have to think through. They're going to be your doctors and your nurses. They're going to be your cops. They're going to be the people that will remake the fundamental social contract that is at the heart of the American experience. Either they will have the tools or they will produce returns that will make our country to be less than it can and should be. To invest in them is to invest in us, in our future.
That was great. But we're bummed you had to watch that whole video with that pesky black box. Our tech folks informed me that it was a Zoom issue with video optimization and GPU, whatever that means. But don't worry, we'll send the video to all of you in our post-event email, along with all of the slides, data, resources that were shared throughout the event today. We hope you can rewatch and share the video widely. Next, I'm excited to introduce a producer with Rational Middle Media, Melissa Brennan. Melissa will be joining me for a brief interview. Melissa, do you mind hopping onto the camera with me? Great. Can you start off by telling us a little bit about the Rational Middle Media and your mission, as well as why you have chosen immigration as one of your areas of focus?
Sure. Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for having us here and for showing the episode. It's truly an honor. We're really excited to be here. And definitely a big thank you to Dr. Bob, Yael Ross, Wendy Cervantes, all the work you do at both Children at Risk and at CLASS. So Rational Media, we're a media company that really works to create fact-based discussions that we hope are leading to real life solutions. And we do that through several different ways. We do that through our documentary series, through podcasts, through events, through social media, where we work with leading minds across the country to kind of bring the facts about these really contentious and divisive issues. So the issues that we typically work with are ones that tend to divide our country. But not only that, are also issues that are important to us. And Stan Merrick approached us back in 2015 with the idea of doing a series that focused on immigration. And the joke around the office, it's just kind of not, I guess, that funny anymore, but it was like, yeah, immigration, like it seems like that's easy. Of course, immigrants should be here. Like what? Yeah, we can do a series on that. And just the past 5 or 6, 7 years, it's realized what an uphill climb this was going to be. But we think we're moving in the right direction. You know, Immigration is now an award-winning series with over 3.5 million views, the episodes, and really kind of what we've just done here today. The idea is that these episodes become a catalyst for conversation.
That's great. Yeah, thank you for sharing some of the historical context, right? And we know, you know, Stan Merrick, just a huge supporter and ally of the immigration movement here in Texas, even of children at risk. I noticed that the video was filmed here in Houston, right? And so here in Texas, access to education for immigrant students has certainly been considered a controversial issue over the years. As highlighted in the video, the Plyler ruling was a result of a lawsuit against Texas based on a state law that prohibited undocumented students from accessing public K-12 education. Yet, ironically, Texas was the first state to adopt an in-state tuition policy in 2001 in recognition of the importance of opening the doors to post-secondary education to the state's undocumented student population. And yet, in recent years, and as was mentioned in the federal panel, the state of Texas has been one of the states seeking to challenge the legality of DACA program. And most recently, our governor made comments about wanting the Supreme Court to revisit the Plyler ruling. What made you choose the topic of education for immigrant students as a specific area of focus? And why is it something the broader public should be concerned about?
Well, the newest episodes in our series, we kind of tackled 4 major issues: healthcare, workforce, crime, and education. And the reason we focused on all of these issues is they impact the individual, right? So if you don't have access to healthcare, it impacts you. If you don't have a job, if someone commits a crime against you, if you don't have access to education, it impacts you, the individual. But more importantly, it has a broader impact, a broader implication for our entire country. So children were incredibly important to both Stan and his wife, also important to us. And I'm guessing if you're here at the summit, really important to you too. I'm assuming I'm probably not the only parent here, but for children, you know, I mean, it's children. It seems like such an easy get. We should be protecting children in our society. We should be providing opportunities, and we should be helping them to become engaged, bright, positive citizenry population. So, of course, there's that aspect of it, right? There's that humanitarian aspect. And then also that education is mandated by law, right? So we are striving to protect equal access to education. And really, there's kind of 2 impacts. There's the negative impact. What happens if we don't include children and if we don't include some of our population in education? So it's funny, coming right after the panel that was just hosted, mental health, right, of our children and the children and their families. I mean, what is it, you know, for a child to go into a situation where they're not sure when they leave school if their parents are going to be there? I mean, I remember Yael Ross telling a story of children actually coming to school with a suitcase just in case they may not be going home to their parents. It's as simple as something like a family member being scared to go see their child's play. If we include those children, I mean, the mental health aspect is incredibly, sorry, I've lost my words, but it impacts people's mental health. And then also, if you don't include children, you don't include this portion of the population, then, you know, looking long term, that is a portion of our population that we will also need to take care of. And, you know, regardless, if people that don't have access to education, they may be causing problems for our society. It's just an unanticipated consequence. But also there's a positive side, right, to including all children in our education system. What does it look like if we do? And of course, big impact is that children, they feel safe and they feel included. And when you feel safe, when you can go into a space knowing that you are welcome there, knowing that you are meant to be there, then you can like let that fear, you can let that go away. And like now the focus is on accessing that education. When you gain an education, when you have access to education, we all know that provides for opportunities and for options. And an educated child is going to become an educated adult. And when we have an educated adult, we have an educated workforce, we have a productive workforce, we have a productive population that's also going to be providing us with a healthy economy. And, you know, not to get really, I don't know, like kind of take it out of the realm of like that kind of human focus. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's important for us as a country to have a productive economy and a healthy economy. I mean, we look at the past several years during this pandemic, get supply chains, labor shortages, things like that. It is important for us to educate and provide those opportunities and options for all citizens and all people here in our country.
Great points, right? And that's exactly the theme that we see come up again and again through today's event, right? That whatever happens to immigrant children impacts all of us, all of our families, and everyone in society, right? Everyone in our society. Our lives are inherently linked, right? In our own humanity, our economies, right? And so that's important, right? Like education for the children, like we need to continue to move that forward. And even just like thinking around even the hints of, you know, challenges to Plyler, losing something so fundamental, such a fundamental right for our children. And the fear that the consequences of that, right? Whatever happens in the legal space and the fights that will continue, but we will know that the impacts are being felt now, right? Children are, you know, hate and rhetoric also shows up in the classroom when we don't create that welcoming open space for care for our children. Finally, before we head to a short intermission, what tips would you give to those who are working for advocating for rights of children?
Well, I'm glad that you like left it with like the easy question. No, I'm just kidding. You know, what I would say is that there's probably not a one size fits all message, right? You know, if there was, we'd already be where we want to be. We'd have the results we wanted. So I think it's, for us, what we found is creating spaces for people to have those conversations and creating spaces where kind of removing some of the emotion, removing those like kind of finger wagging, histrionic, really intense moments and focusing on the facts. At the end of the day, there are going to be some people at the extremes. You are never going to reach them. And I'm not saying like give up, but focus your energy on the people that you can begin to make a difference with. And for us, it's that rational middle, right? It's those people that are kind of at the edge of that center that maybe haven't quite made a decision, are still a little on the edge, or maybe just are kind of have preconceived notions, right? And when you present them with facts, there tends to be a, oh, I didn't realize that, or oh, I didn't know, you know. And even myself, like working in this field, thinking about things in terms of like our immigration system and how difficult it is to apply for status here, that waiting in lines and the application process, et cetera. Like I was just unaware of what a process that would be. So these videos, these episodes that we've created, we like to use them as tools. And we really recommend that you do too. You know, these are episodes that present the facts. They're easily digestible. They are free to distribute and free to use. And we encourage everyone to please use them, but use these as a place to start. Use these as table setting to begin having those conversations and begin taking those small steps to make change. It's not going to be an overnight thing. And I think as we've watched this past couple of years, we know it's not going to be a big one and done. We're probably going to have to attack this from many different angles. But at the end of the day, we've seen it work with these episodes, with these videos. We've seen it work in conferences, at events, in Zoom webinars just like this, where we take the issue, we distill it down to some basic facts and allow people to use that as a starting point where everyone in the room has those facts to begin a conversation. And we hope you out there, whoever's watching, we hope you'll use them to start those conversations as well.
Well, thank you, Melissa. You're really hinting us to our next panel, which is we're going to have some amazing comms narrative folks, so we can continue talking around narrative change that is so critical in any strategy to move the needle forward. So thank you so much, Melissa. And again, we'll be sharing out the video, the links, Rational Middle's resources in the post-event email with all of our attendees. Great. So, we, as we were talking about, right, immigrants and families are often spoken about in ways that does not encompass the true diversity of experiences that make up the community. This session will feature a discussion on changing the narrative of how immigrant families are perceived, including by working directly with impacted families to share their own stories. That's something that's been continuing to come up on our panels today. I'm excited to introduce our panel moderator, Lynn Tremonte, Director of the Ohio Immigrant Alliance. Joining her for this conversation is Elaine De Leon, Director of Communications with the Tahrir Justice Center, and Nekesa Apadi, I hope I pronounced that right, Communication Director with Black Alliance for Just Immigration. Please join us up on camera, and I'm excited for this dialogue to continue.
Thank you so much, Guadalupe. It's great to be here. I'm Lynn Tremonte with the Ohio Immigrant Alliance and also a communications consultant with Anacaona. So just to set the scene for this conversation, I want to ask the audience a few questions. What do you think the dominant narrative is about families seeking safety at the United States border? Is it that they are heroes, brave, courageous parents we should strive to be like, they love their children? Or is it they're bad parents, they're coming to work and that's bad, they're flooding our borders, they should stay home, the borders are out of control and chaotic? I think you know the answer. Let's think about the dominant narrative about immigration legal changes needed and why hasn't it led to the policy changes? Legalization is stalled. The immigration courts, which have an outsized impact on people's ability to stay here, are deliberately designed to fail immigrants, and they err on the side of denials and restrictions, yet that's not part of the dominant narrative at all. What about the dominant narrative about immigrants in general? So the pro-immigrant side has a couple different takes on this. One is that immigrants are good for the rest of us. They pay taxes, they do all these things, it's transactional, it appeals to US American self-interest. Another take on that is that immigrants are us, they belong here. That narrative can also challenge power dynamics, the dignity and necessity of all work. There's stereotypes now against certain types of work, right? That contributes to the power structure and the white supremacy that is our country is built on. So, which one is dominant out of those two? For the anti-immigrants, they have all of the narratives. It's immigrants are not us, immigrants are bad for us, culture wars, replacement, white supremacy, they feed into all of that. And most recently, we're starting to see narratives about nation of immigrants, opportunity for all being challenged. But the point is that we need to keep going. We need to have a more honest conversation about the country's birth, history, power dynamics, systemic racism. And I don't think our immigration narratives right now, the dominant ones, are really doing that. So, but you don't want to hear from me, you want to hear from Elaine and Nekesa. So we're just going to ask a couple questions and then we will take a few questions from the audience. So my first question, and we'll start with Elaine and then Nekesa, is let's just get on the same page. When you say narrative and you're talking about narrative change, What do you mean? What is narrative? What is narrative change? And what are some of the tools that you use to achieve narrative change?
Thanks, Lynn. Yeah, I think, before I start, I think it's just great to see this topic getting airtime at a conference like this, where we're talking about changing systems and making sure those changes stick. I think too often conversations around communications tend to be deprioritized, which I think is a really, it's a disservice, because to me, changing the narrative, I think, is one of the most important things that we can do to drive the policy and the cultural shift that we're all wanting to see, on behalf of the communities that we're all serving, or the communities that we're a part of. So when we're talking about changing the narrative, I think the word itself can mean a lot of things to different communities, to different folks. But for me, to put it simply, from my perspective, for the purposes of this discussion, I like to define it as the story, or the stories that we tell about immigrants, and how people see immigrants and these communities and our communities because of the stories that they're hearing and seeing. And then what are they repeating to their own communities and to their own circles? And this can be, from a communications perspective, a really wide range of things, like how are immigrants being reported about in the news, how immigrants are being portrayed or not portrayed in popular culture, movies, TVs, things like that. But it could also be just as simple as like looking inwardly into our organizations, especially those of us who are immigrant focused organizations, and asking ourselves, what is the story that we are telling about our work, about the folks and the communities that we are serving? Who's making decisions about those stories and what those narratives are on behalf of the organization? And then who is telling those stories on behalf of the organization? For those of you who aren't familiar, I'm with the Tahereh Justice Center, and our work is mostly around providing free legal and social services to immigrant survivors of gender-based violence who are seeking safety in the United States. So we are at that intersection of violence against women and immigrant rights. So my work as part of the communications team and the team at the center on behalf of these folks, we're often fighting against two sets of narratives. One is the misogynistic, harmful narratives about women, and then the other is around the xenophobic narratives around immigrants. And so for Tahereh, one of the ways that we are challenging these narratives and trying to shift these narratives is by being as survivor-centered in our communications as possible. And what I mean by that is not just telling like one emotional sob story about, survivors after another. For us, we define that by leading with how policy changes impact survivors. It means when we do tell these stories that we focus on the resilience and the strength of the survivors instead of focusing on the harm and the trauma that they've experienced and what they've been able to do with the resources that they're connected with because of their own strength and their own agency. It means that we put the individual survivor in the driver's seat when we work together to shape the narrative of their personal journey to safety, even when it might not be completely aligned with our organizational talking points. It's really important that we give them the agency and the ownership over their story, because it's their story. And frankly, sometimes it means walking through an entire process of preparing someone to tell their story externally, and then being okay when that person, after hours and hours of working with them, decides it's not something that they're comfortable with, or want to go a different direction or do something different from what they want, what you had planned to doing with them. But I think like we as an organization are committed to be as survivor-centered as possible with our communications, because we believe that folks who are directly impacted, the fact that if they had the ability to set the tone, to lead the conversation, I think that's the critical piece to getting, not just changing the narrative, full stop, but actually getting to the change that we need to see as a society.
Thank you, Elaine. Nakessa, how do you define narrative and narrative change, and what are some tactics that you think work well?
Thank you. So I'm Nakessa Oputi, and I'm Communications Director at the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. And Elaine has really said a lot, and I echo everything, so I'm not going to speak too much longer. But I will add that, you know, for us, we work at the intersection of immigration and civil rights, which includes criminalization. And so oftentimes a lot of the things you've talked about, Elaine, really resonate because it's not just enough, in terms of like changing the narrative. It's not just the context or content of what people are talking about, but who's saying it and who's in positions of authority to say it. How are we doing leadership development? Because you asked about tactics, and that's one of the things is that oftentimes people speak on behalf of impacted people, and yet because we have specific talking points that we want to push, and that the impacted person might not deliver them the way that we want them to. And so it's very important that one, as we talk about talking points, they shouldn't be out of character for the person, but they should be in alignment. So I'm not talking about like value alignment is very important, even for impacted people to understand the political moment that they're in, even when they're sharing their personal story, because personal narrative is important, but what does it do beyond amplifying that person's specific story? How does it advance the collective liberation of all the people that you're working with or that your work represents? And so for us, that has been very, very important, especially with our organizers who are the ones who work directly with people in the different states that Baji is located. And I think some other things will come out through as we talk, but yeah, Elaine laid it out very well in terms of defining what narrative shift is.
Thank you both. Okay, so you both have mentioned that people who are living the experiences that require policy changes should be the ones telling their stories. There's a whole host of ethical, privacy, and other cultural, other issues that go along with that. So if you're giving advice to a nonprofit that wants to involve their membership in communications work, could you give maybe a few points of how you would help them, tell them to prepare?
Sure, I can jump in on that. I think on our end, the words that come to mind is informed consent. We have a process with the communications team where if any survivor, a former client of Tahereh comes forward, and either we proactively ask them if they want to be involved in an external speaking experience, or they come to us and say, I want to share my story as a part of my personal healing journey, or as a way to advocate for myself and for my communities. We really spend time working with them to help them understand that they know what that means, right? What does it mean when you talk to a reporter? What are the things that could potentially go wrong? They could take your quote out of context. You might have if the reporter doesn't have an understanding of the topic, might represent you or, frame you in a way that you ultimately may not have control over later. So there's a lot of sort of media literacy and spokesperson, we do a lot of helping them understand what they're getting themselves into. And we do that every step of the way, all the way up until, the time that they go on the record with someone. I think also helping folks think through what parts of their stories, kind of speaking to what Nekesa was saying about the political moment, what are the things that is important for them to share, and what are the aspects of their personal experience that they feel would be helpful to represent kind of the purpose that they themselves are speaking out, whether it's to educate others in their community, make folks who are in situations like they're in feel less alone. We, really help them hone in on what are the things that feel the most helpful for them and the purposes that they have when they step out and decide that this is something they want to do.
Yeah, thank you, Elaine. One thing I'll add too is if you're preparing as comms or an organization, even if you don't have a communications department, is to also be careful around trauma, like people having to relieve their trauma by retelling their story over and over. And so there's multiple things. One is, you talked about informed consent earlier, and like making sure that people have resources or access to be able to decompress. Because oftentimes this for other people, it might be that one story that you heard about someone's horrific experience, but this is their life. This is, they have to come back and sit with themselves once they have shared their story with you. So it's very important that you handle that with care and make sure that people get support, and whatever that support would look like. It doesn't have to be therapy. It could be therapy. It could be a massage. It could be a treat of some kind. It could even be, because a lot of the folks we work with are also religious. It could involve that aspect as well. And then also, I often hesitate to overshare people's story as a tool to get people to care about something. So when you think about like what happened last year with Haitian migrants, and the ways in which they were being beaten by Border Patrol and, stuck in a camp. It's important that we tell and amplify these stories. At the same time, we don't need to interview all those Haitians and hear them cry and talk about the violence that they've experienced, because as communications people, we should use the tools we have to draw compassion towards that, but you can't force people to be compassionate enough to change laws. And this is where anti-Blackness comes in, right? Because we know that for us, a lot of the things that we talk about that people are experiencing are universally known to be cruel. They're universally known to be harmful. And yet it is unfair that we have to explain to people why it is so. Why is it unfair that a mother is separated from her child at the border? Like, that is not even a thing we should be talking about as an explanation. We should just be saying this should not be happening. And so we don't need to interview a mother at the border who's been separated from her child, or the child, what does it mean to be separated from your mother? We all know what that means. So we don't need to replay that trauma for folks. And so that's the two things I'd add on top of what Elaine shared, which I echo.
Great. We have a question from an attendee, and I'm curious to your answers as well. It says, can you ask Nakessa and Elaine about offering compensation, travel, counseling, et cetera, to folks who are sharing their stories? In orgs I've worked at, there has been pushback in offering any sort of compensation or care. In other words, how have they secured buy-in internally and from decision makers, board of directors, et cetera? I also want to give a little anecdote, which is, and Nakessa knows this, that Netflix profiled a Mauritanian family and living undocumented and refused to give them compensation. And I believe they said it was based on journalistic ethics. So that really angered me, because I know that media companies are paying other people to tell their stories. They're getting 20 or 5-figure, 6-figure things. And what Awa did was she opened up her home to talk about the most painful thing in her life ever, and her role with it in her family, and she got nothing, right? So at the Ohio Immigrant Alliance, we have started paying stipends to people that are creating videos for the advocacy work, or attending meetings and speaking to department officials about their situation and how it impacts and that impacts others as well. So what are your thoughts on that? Is that an approach to take? If not, why not? And how do you convince sort of the people that control the purse strings if it is a good idea?
Yeah, I'll say, I think the question of compensation is complicated, and there's some things that are more straightforward. So for example, if you're having people come to DC to testify, which I also do not like, the idea of like impacted people going to Congress people and crying and saying, this is my trauma, this is my story. And I get that it's part of this system that, of political change, that people have to see people to know the impact it's having on them. But if you do that anyway, please, of course, pay for their accommodation, pay for their flight, pay for their meals, and as an honorarium, because they will be in a city that's away from home. And majority of the people who we're talking about are going to be working class folks who are having to take time off work so that they can come and accomplish whatever this thing it is that you're doing. So when I look at it like that, that's not, it's not even payment, it's proper compensation for their labor in the same way that we are being paid to do the work that we're doing. Or even if we're volunteering, because sometimes some of us are in volunteer positions, even as a volunteer, there is still some capital that you have that the person you're trying to get to do this does not. The Netflix example you give is a great one too, because, and this one has a lot more nuance, because journalistic, and I'm a former journalist who also got into trouble with editors around certain things like this. There is with good reason that if you pay someone, they might not be telling this, you might be paying them to tell that story. So I would say that the way people should approach it and how you get buy-in is that we know that this is a true experience. And like you said earlier, everyone is being compensated to work on this. And this is also seen, this is labor. This is not just that they're telling their story. And so if you approach it in that way, then that gets into the angle of compensation. But also you need to be careful, right? Because there are people who then it's like you need to be able to stand behind what the story the person is telling, that it's not because of the compensation. But the same guideline should be used even for us, because we're all paid with our jobs, all of us. So does that mean what I'm saying right now is not authentic or real because I get a paycheck today, actually I get a paycheck. So is what I'm saying now not as authentic than if I was doing this as a volunteer? It's not. And so if we use those same standards with the people that we work with, that upholds equity, but also it shows that you respect this person enough to respect the integrity. And this is why you're working with them, and this is why they're advancing your campaign or the collective work that you're doing.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, so at Tahare, we do have an honorarium and stipend process for survivors who step up and say that that's sharing their story is something that they want to do. And it's, all the way at the moment that they share that they're interested in that, there's a process for making sure that they're compensated for every instance where their story is shared externally, whether or not it's them sharing it or it's something that we do as a communications team and retelling their story. And I think to add to what Nakasa is saying, to me, it's really the value of what types of expertise we put value to, right? Like if folks are seen as valuable because they have some sort of academic or earned or acquired expertise of things, and those people, when they do lectures, they get stipends and honorarium for those types of appearances. I think we have to say that we also value lived experience in the same way, and that folks who are sharing lived expertise is something that we also value enough to provide a stipend or a compensation for. And I think going back to what Nakasa was saying before in terms of being using stories in a strategic way, I think that there is something to be said about making sure that even if the audience, maybe they get to your doorstep, maybe they come to you because they have a sense of justice for individuals, that we as communications people need to be moving them along a journey, that they don't need to hear a sad story from someone to understand why the system needs to change, right? So like helping folks who are coming through the doors as supporters, moving them from an individual kind of based justice to something that is more systemic, and understanding kind of why like the larger issues need to be addressed. And so I think using stories as just one strategy in a communications professional's toolbox can really help move even just the audience along to where you want them to be, to that point of understanding why the systems need to be different than not just trying to quote unquote save that one person whose story they read, right?
Thank you. Yeah, and Nakasa gave some examples about how to convince your boards of directors or whatever that this is important. I think another one I would add is that a lot of times people have to take off of work or take an extended lunch break or dinner break, things like that, in order to participate. So, please never ask somebody to do that and not give them, make them whole or beyond whole.
Let me just add, I had talked earlier on about mental health support, and the person whose question you read asked it. That without a guarantee, even I don't think that should not be negotiable at all. Because if your board of directors or your leadership does not understand the impact of retelling and telling your story and the trauma that creates, then you have a bigger question to be answering around what the values of your organization are. Because that means that you're exploiting people's stories for your gain. And so it's because we all know, even when you watch a terrible movie or you hear a bad story yourself, you know what you go through. Most of us have experienced some of trauma at some level or another. You know what it feels like to tell that. Now imagine asking someone to tell this story to an audience, to have their picture on your website, to have it retold every time someone Googles them, this is one of the things that shows up. So that you cannot think about what that person's experience is and that trauma is, begs a bigger question beyond the providing for that care for the person.
Yep, thank you, that's awesome. We got another question in the chat, and it says, how might challenging the meta-narrative be part of the solution? I mean, the meta-narrative of people, voters' minds, not politicians, forming only two sides, one of which is rational, righteous, and right side of history, while the other is bigoted, ignorant, and uncaring. Might such a meta-narrative cause would-be persuadable folks and allies to resist and perpetuate a takes two to tango culture war that no one wins? To be transparent about my hypothesis. Anybody have thoughts on that?
I'm gonna reread it.
Okay. I'm gonna start then. We're in a culture war and our side has not realized that. And I've become radicalized in the last couple of years. Trump radicalized me, but I think we need more shaming. I think we need to call people out for, not respecting the dignity of all types of work and sort of prioritizing office work over cleaning offices, things like that. So that's my take, but I think that hopefully Nakesa and Elaine are maybe more rational than me.
I can jump in. I think like the previous panel was talking about, there's not a one size fits all, right? Like we're all thinking about different audiences. We're all thinking about different calls to action and what's going to compel people to take that action. And it could be that some folks who maybe see themselves as generally good people, do no harm type of folks may resonate with being told, well, really, like some of the things that Lynn shared. But I think it could also be that there are folks who won't come to the table if they think they're their perspectives and their views might be kind of in the hot seat, right? So I think it really depends on knowing who your audience is and what works for the specific audiences that you're trying to do. And you probably as an organization could take all of these different approaches and voices and tactics at any given time, depending on what you're trying to, the change that you're trying to do, or whatever the call to action is that you're trying to get your supporters to deploy. I think for me, audiences are so vast, like there's no such thing as a general audience. I always have to think about like, who are the ones that are going to hear this? Who are the ones that are going to be, compelled by this, most likely to be compelled by this. And even if it's not something that I would probably, it may not be the thing that I say when I, as an individual, is talking about this with my friends or, my peers in conversation. I always try to figure out how, what is the right message or what is the right approach for the organization based on what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I'll say political education is key. There are certain assumptions we make about people, about what they know. So let's take, for example, abolition, right? Like there is a lot, abolition is used very much as it's a word of the day. And oftentimes people don't understand what they mean when they say they're abolitionists, or what they mean when they're rejecting abolition. And so I see like part of our roles as communications people is to breaking down and talking through some of these things. And it could be different ways, whether it's like webinars that you're having or conversations in small circles. To the earlier conversations about the right and right wing, I absolutely have no strategy, no tactics. I'm not interested in involving with them. This is the same thing that stance that we have around white racists, whether they're liberal or conservatives, because there is, I think I walked in when one of the speakers was talking about the middle, reaching to the middle because of things that they might not know. And so those groups of people, that what I would say for them, it's like things around political education, yes, because they might not know about a specific issue. But when it comes to bigotry, which is a lot of what we face in the work that we do, there is no educating people, because they know when someone is being anti-Black, when they're being racist to a Black kid, they know exactly what they're doing. When we see what has happened with Ukrainians being let into the country within 3 days of that European war starting, we know that this administration knew exactly what it was doing. When they've been separating children from families, they know exactly what they're doing. So we'll call them out and we'll demand that they do better, but like there is no, there's no teaching them not to be racist, because they know exactly what they're doing. And whether it's like sexism and all that stuff. I mean, I think there are things that people don't necessarily realize are problematic. So if I think of like laws, if you think about like any of the immigration laws right now, a lot of them have criminal bars. And oftentimes people are not thinking what that consequence of that means. So for us, that means, Black immigrants end up not benefiting from a lot of these policies because of the criminalization that happens outside of immigration. And so that is something that is part of the political education tool, that you can talk to people and educate them about that. But the other stuff, what's that woman, Rebecca Aducci from the ICE director, who's an evil, evil human being. She knows exactly what she's doing. She's gone to court and defended and said she's okay with children being in detention. So how are you going to educate a person like that? Like what is the starting conversation you have with someone like that? It's zero, because they don't see the humanity of these people. They don't see our own humanity of us as experts doing this work. So no point of engagement.
Thanks, Nakessa. Well, I think we have to wrap. I think we could go on for a lot more time. And so the next time we come back to this conversation, my question is going to be, what is the role of images in narrative change? You all saw Murar Joseph, what he has described as the most embarrassing, horrific moment of his life, captured on camera without his agency. It obviously had a huge impact on the way people saw what was happening at the southern border, but it also had these other problems. So think about images. It's important in narrative change, and I'll turn it back to Guadalupe.
Thank you all. This is one of my favorite topics, communication strategy, central, right, to any systems and social change. So thank you all for dialoguing with us. We could talk about this for hours. We'll probably have to do another event on it for sure. Just welcome y'all back to dialogue with us. I'm grateful for the opportunity to MC this program and elevate the work of this powerhouse lineup of speakers. Thank you all for taking the time to be with us for this conversation today. You each shared some impactful work that you do and your unique perspective, and I cannot wait to continue this important work together. Children, families, neighbors, and community members have always faced trials and tribulations as they migrate to our country. And while we continue to witness the resiliency of our communities, we know that there is still so much that needs to change. That's why, as advocates working in this space, we know that it is critical to center the needs of children and families, especially those most in the margins, to access mental health care, to having the resources that they need to meet their basic needs, or receiving an equitable education that all children deserve. As we heard today, we know that immigration reform is too important to put off any longer. When the system around us continue to fail immigrant children and families, the solution becomes clear. It's collective power to change those systems and collective care to meet the needs of our community now. We understand the flaws and solutions that we heard from our advocates today. We cannot be successful when our advocacy is not linked to other efforts for structural change. We're talking about the immigration justice movement, the child rights movement, racial justice, educational right. And as we heard from our advocates today, we know we must grow our political power to break through the partisan gridlock and the lack of political will that is holding us back. We must engage and energize advocates and community across political, racial, and geographic lines as our communities and societies depend on the safety, health, education, and well-being for all children and families. To continue engaging in this conversation and our work, check us out on social media for more events and resources. And again, let's give one final thank you to our audience for being with us today for this important conversation. We encourage you to get in touch with any question or collaboration opportunities. Again, we will share the slide deck and all of the resources and recordings in an email to all of y'all who registered by tomorrow. Yes, tomorrow afternoon. And if you thought today's programming was particularly impactful, I encourage you to register for our free upcoming event, Full Steam Ahead, Creating Equitable Pathways to STEM Careers, on Thursday, June 28th from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central. The summit is one of our team's favorite each year. This year, we'll dive into the issues of STEM education and a distinct focus on building a robust and qualified pipeline of professionals in the wake of the pandemic. This learning opportunity will highlight the work of industry leaders, educators, and nonprofit innovators working to improve access to STEM education for all students. My team should have shared the link to register for that event in the chat, or you can email anyone on our team for details. Before we close out for the day, I have one final request for all of you. We encourage you to take a moment to share your feedback on today's event with us using the QR code on your screen or the link shared in the chat. Thank you all. Again, thank you to our panelists, audience, staff at Children at Risk who worked so hard to put this together, all of our partners who supported us in this process. And we'll see you on July 28th if you can come to our STEM event. Thank you so much.